The Mediterranean sun blazed over the construction site where a new city was rising from Egyptian sand in 331 BCE. Alexander the Great stood at the western edge of the Nile Delta, watching his architects mark the boundaries of what would become the most important center of learning in ancient history. He chose this location with the strategic mind of a conqueror and the vision of a philosopher, positioning his namesake city at the crossroads between East and West, between the ancient wisdom of Egypt and the intellectual vigor of Greece. Alexander would never see his city completed. He died 8 years later in Babylon, his empire fragmenting among his generals like a shattered mirror. But one of those generals, Ptolemy, understood that Alexander had planted something more valuable than a military outpost. When Ptolemy claimed Egypt as his portion of the divided empire, he inherited not just fertile lands and ancient monuments, but the seed of an idea that would transform human knowledge forever. Ptolemy VIII was an unusual ruler for his time. While other successors of Alexander fought endless wars over territory, Ptolemy focused on building something that would outlast any battlefield victory. He had served as one of Alexander's bodyguards and closest companions, witnessing firsthand how his leader had collected scholars and texts from every conquered land. Aristotle himself had tutored Alexander, instilling in him a deep respect for knowledge that Ptolemy now sought to institutionalize on an unprecedented scale. The idea began simply enough. Ptolemy wanted to create a shrine to the Muses, those 9 Greek goddesses who inspired art and science. But this Mauseon, as it would be called, would be more than a temple. It would be a research institute where the greatest minds of the age could work without worrying about food, shelter, or political interference. Scholars would receive generous salaries, free meals, and exemption from taxes. They would walk through covered colonnades discussing mathematics and astronomy, dine together in a common hall, and most importantly, have access to every book ever written. This last ambition seemed impossible at first. Books in the ancient world were rare and precious objects. Each one had to be copied by hand onto papyrus, a process that could take months for a single lengthy work. Most private collections contained perhaps a few dozen scrolls. The famous library at Athens, considered impressive for its time, held only a few hundred. Ptolemy envisioned something different entirely. He wanted tens of thousands of scrolls, hundreds of thousands eventually. He wanted every piece of human knowledge gathered under one roof. To achieve this unprecedented goal, Ptolemy appointed Demetrius of Phalerum as the first head librarian around 295 BCE. Demetrius had been a student of Aristotle and had governed Athens for a decade before being exiled. He brought with him not just his own considerable learning, but also connections throughout the Greek intellectual world. Together, Ptolemy and Demetrius developed acquisition strategies that ranged from generous to ruthless. They began by purchasing scrolls from private collections across the Mediterranean. Royal agents arrived in Athens' roads and other centers of learning with bags of gold, buying original texts or paying scribes to make copies. The Ptolemaic dynasty poured unprecedented resources into this project. Where other kings built monuments to themselves, Ptolemy built a monument to knowledge itself. The annual budget for acquiring and copying texts exceeded the entire treasury of some smaller kingdoms. But purchasing was too slow for Ptolemy's ambitions. He instituted a law that would seem shocking even by ancient standards. Every ship that docked in Alexandria's busy harbor had to surrender any books on board for inspection. Scribes in the library would then copy these texts, keeping the originals and returning the copies to their owners. Ship captains learned to hide their most precious scrolls or avoid Alexandria altogether, but the steady stream of confiscated knowledge continued to flow into the library's growing collection. The library's scribes developed sophisticated techniques for managing this flood of information. They standardized the format of scrolls, establishing consistent column widths and line lengths that made texts easier to read and copy. They created detailed catalogues noting not just titles and authors, but also the number of lines in each work, allowing them to detect incomplete or corrupted copies. They compared multiple versions of the same text, attempting to establish authoritative editions free from scribal errors. This textual scholarship reached its most ambitious scale with the translation of Hebrew scriptures into Greek. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, who succeeded his father around 285 BCE, commissioned 72 Jewish scholars to translate their sacred texts for the library's collection. According to legend, these scholars worked independently, yet produced identical translations, proving divine inspiration. The reality was probably messier, involving heated debates over word choices and interpretations that would echo through centuries of religious thought. But the resulting Septuagint gave the Greek-speaking world access to Hebrew wisdom and helped preserve texts that might otherwise have been lost to history. The physical structure of the library reflected its grand ambitions. The main building stood within the royal quarter of Alexandria, connected to the palace complex by covered walkways. Its reading rooms faced north to capture steady, indirect light that would not damage the delicate papyrus. Storage rooms maintained careful climate control, with thick walls moderating temperature and special treatments to prevent insect damage. The famous lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, stood nearby, its beacons symbolically illuminating both ships at sea and scholars at study. Within these walls, scribes worked in specialized copying rooms, bent over their desks from dawn to dusk. They developed a division of labor that resembled a modern publishing house. Junior scribes would prepare papyrus and mix ink according to precise formulas that would resist fading. Senior scribes would copy the main text, leaving spaces for illustrations and decorative capitals. Specialist scribes would add these artistic elements, while editors would check the completed scrolls against originals, marking corrections in the margins. The library employed hundreds of these workers, making it one of the largest non-military government operations in the ancient world. Beyond the scribes were the scholars themselves, drawn from every corner of the Mediterranean. The Ptolemies offered them something unprecedented in history. They could pursue pure research without needing to teach students or serve wealthy patrons. They received free room and board in the Mausion, access to the library's collections, and the company of fellow intellectuals engaged in similar pursuits. This community of scholars transformed Alexandria into the intellectual capital of the ancient world. They came from Athens and Syracuse, from Babylon and Jerusalem, bringing with them the accumulated wisdom of their homelands. In the Mauseon's gardens, a mathematician from Cyrene might discuss geometric proofs with an astronomer from Samos, while a poet from Kos refined verses under a nearby tree. These casual conversations often sparked insights that would reshape human understanding. The library's collection grew with astonishing speed. Within a generation of its founding, it contained over 200,000 scrolls. By the height of its glory, some ancient sources claim it held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, though these numbers may include duplicate copies. The catalogue alone, compiled by the scholar Callimachus around 250 BCE, filled 120 scrolls and represented the first systematic attempt to organize all human knowledge. Callimachus divided literature into categories that still influence how we organize libraries today. He separated poetry from prose, history from philosophy, medicine from mathematics. Within each category, he arranged authors alphabetically and chronologically, adding biographical notes and critical commentary. His Pinakes, as this catalogue was called, became a model for scholarly bibliography that would be imitated across the ancient world. But the library was more than a warehouse of scrolls. It was a living institution where knowledge was not just preserved, but actively created. The Mauseon included lecture halls where scholars presented their latest discoveries, dissection rooms where anatomists explored the human body, and astronomical observation platforms where the movements of stars and planets were carefully recorded. The botanical gardens contained specimens from across the known world, allowing scholars to study plants mentioned in ancient texts and test their medicinal properties. The early Ptolemaic rulers understood that knowledge was power in a very practical sense. The library's collection included not just literary and philosophical works, but also technical manuals on engineering, agriculture, and military tactics. Royal engineers consulted these texts when designing new irrigation systems for the Nile Delta. Military commanders studied accounts of Alexander's campaigns and earlier battles. Doctors referenced medical texts from Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia when treating patients in the city's hospitals. This practical application of knowledge extended to trade and diplomacy. The library's scholars translated commercial documents, helping Alexandria become the busiest port in the Mediterranean. They studied foreign languages and customs, advising the Ptolemaic court on negotiations with Rome, Carthage, and the other Hellenistic kingdoms. The library made Alexandria not just wealthy but cosmopolitan, a city where Greek merchants, Egyptian priests, Jewish scholars, and visitors from India and Ethiopia could find common ground in the pursuit of learning. The acquisition methods became increasingly creative as the library's reputation grew. Ptolemy III Euergetes, who ruled from 246 to 222 BCE, devised perhaps the most audacious scheme. He convinced Athens to lend him the original manuscripts of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the three great tragedians whose works were considered sacred texts of Greek culture. He deposited 15 talents of silver as security, an enormous sum that could have funded a military campaign. Then he had the texts copied on the finest papyrus available, sent the copies back to Athens, and kept the originals for Alexandria. He forfeited his deposit without complaint, considering the original manuscripts worth far more than any amount of silver. This story, whether entirely accurate or somewhat embellished, illustrates the extraordinary value the Ptolemies placed on authentic texts. They understood that each copy introduced potential errors, that original manuscripts represented the purest form of an author's thoughts. The library's scholars developed techniques for textual criticism that attempted to reconstruct original readings by comparing multiple copies, noting variations, and applying logical analysis to determine which version was most likely correct. The scholars also recognized that knowledge existed beyond written texts. They interviewed sailors about distant lands, recorded oral traditions from Egyptian priests, and collected mathematical knowledge from Babylonian astronomers. The library sponsored expeditions to gather information, sending teams to measure the distance between cities, map coastlines, and document foreign customs. These findings were incorporated into new texts that expanded the boundaries of Greek geographical and ethnographical knowledge. One of the most significant early projects involved preserving Egyptian knowledge that existed only in hieroglyphic texts or oral traditions. Greek scholars worked with Egyptian priests to translate ancient medical papyri, astronomical observations, and historical records. This collaboration was not always easy. The Egyptian priests guarded many secrets, considering certain knowledge too sacred for foreign eyes. But gradually, through patient diplomacy and genuine scholarly interest, the library's researchers gained access to wisdom that had been accumulated over millennia. The process of translation itself became a sophisticated art. Scholars recognized that literal word-for-word translation often failed to convey meaning across cultural boundaries. They developed techniques for cultural translation, explaining foreign concepts through analogies familiar to Greek readers. They added commentary to clarify references that would be obscure to someone unfamiliar with Egyptian or Babylonian culture. These annotated translations preserved not just the words, but the context necessary to understand them. The library's influence extended far beyond Alexandria's walls. Scholars who studied there returned to their homelands carrying copies of texts and new ideas. Provincial libraries modeled themselves on Alexandria's organization. The standardized editions produced by Alexandrian scholars became the authorized versions used throughout the Greek-speaking world. When Romans began to embrace Greek culture, they looked to Alexandria as the ultimate source of authentic texts and reliable scholarship. The economic impact was equally significant. The papyrus industry employed thousands of workers in the Nile Delta, harvesting reeds, processing them into sheets, and binding them into scrolls. The ink industry developed new formulas that would last longer and resist fading. Specialized cases and storage systems were manufactured to protect valuable scrolls. The book trade became one of Alexandria's major industries, with merchant ships carrying scrolls alongside grain and gold. Yet for all its success, the library faced challenges from its earliest days. The sheer volume of material threatened to overwhelm even the most dedicated scholars. How could anyone read hundreds of thousands of scrolls, even if they devoted their entire life to study? The catalogue helped, but finding specific information within a scroll required unrolling it completely, a time-consuming process that also risked damaging the papyrus. Scholars developed abstract systems and summaries, creating condensed versions of longer works that could be consulted more easily. The question of authenticity plagued the collection. As demand for rare texts grew, forgers began producing fake works attributed to famous authors. The library's scholars developed increasingly sophisticated methods for detecting forgeries, analyzing writing styles, historical references, and the physical characteristics of papyrus and ink. But some forgeries were so skillful that debates about authenticity continued for centuries. Political pressures also threatened the library's mission. Although the early Ptolemies protected scholarly freedom, they expected research to enhance their dynasty's prestige. Scholars who criticized the regime or pursued investigations that might embarrass the royal family faced subtle and not-so-subtle pressure to redirect their efforts. The ideal of pure knowledge pursued for its own sake crashed against the realities of political power. Religious tensions simmered beneath the surface of scholarly collaboration. Greek scholars sometimes dismissed Egyptian religious texts as primitive superstition, while Egyptian priests resented foreign attempts to rationalize their sacred mysteries. Jewish scholars faced pressure to Hellenize their traditions even as they worked to preserve their distinct religious identity. The library contained texts sacred to many different traditions, but reconciling their conflicting claims to truth proved impossible. Despite these challenges, the library's first century represented an extraordinary achievement. Never before had humanity attempted to gather all knowledge in one place. Never before had scholars from such diverse backgrounds worked together in pursuit of understanding. The library created a model for institutional research that would inspire universities, monasteries, and modern research institutions. It demonstrated that knowledge could transcend political boundaries, that wisdom from different cultures could coexist and enrich each other. As the 2nd century BCE began, the library stood at the height of its glory. Its collections continued to grow, its scholars continued to make groundbreaking discoveries, and its influence continued to spread throughout the Mediterranean world. No one could have imagined that this temple of knowledge, protected by the wealth of the Ptolemies and the respect of the civilized world, would one day burn. No one could have predicted that hundreds of thousands of scrolls, representing the accumulated wisdom of centuries, would be reduced to ashes and smoke. The seeds of destruction were already present, hidden beneath the prosperity and intellectual achievements. Political instability in the Ptolemaic dynasty, the rising power of Rome, religious transformations that would reshape the ancient world, and simple human carelessness would all play their roles. But in those early days, as scribes carefully copied ancient texts and scholars debated in the Garden of the Muses, the Library of Alexandria seemed eternal, a permanent monument to the human desire to understand the world and preserve that understanding for future generations. The morning light filtered through the columns of the Mausoleum as Eratosthenes of Cyrene made his way to the library's mathematical texts. He had been appointed chief librarian in 245 BCE, succeeding a line of distinguished scholars who had built the collection into the wonder of the ancient world. But Eratosthenes was not content merely to preserve knowledge. He intended to use the library's vast resources to answer questions that had puzzled humanity since the dawn of consciousness. On this particular morning, Eratosthenes was obsessed with a seemingly simple question that had profound implications. How large was the Earth? Most educated Greeks accepted that the world was spherical, not flat, based on observations of ships disappearing over the horizon and the curved shadow Earth cast on the moon during eclipses. But no one had determined the actual size of this sphere. The answer seemed impossible to calculate without traveling around the entire globe, a journey that would take years if it could be accomplished at all. Yet Eratosthenes believed the answer lay not in physical exploration, but in the mathematical texts and geographical reports that filled the library's shelves. He had been studying accounts from travelers who described a well in the city of Syene, far to the south in Egypt. At noon on the summer solstice, these reports claimed sunlight reached the very bottom of the well, meaning the sun was directly overhead. No shadows were cast by vertical objects at that precise moment. Alexandria, where Eratosthenes stood, was almost directly north of Syene. By measuring the angle of shadows in Alexandria at the same moment the sun was overhead in Syene, he could calculate the curvature of Earth's surface between the two cities. The library's geographical texts gave him the distance between Alexandria and Syene, measured by professional surveyors who counted their steps along the Nile. With these two pieces of information, angle and distance, geometry would reveal Earth's circumference. The calculation required precise measurements and careful mathematical reasoning. Eratosthenes set up a vertical pole in the library's courtyard and waited for the summer solstice. When noon arrived, he measured the shadow's angle at exactly 1/50th of a circle, about 2 degrees in modern terms. If Alexandria and Syene were separated by 1/50th of Earth's circumference, then the total circumference must be 50 times the distance between the cities. The surveyor's records indicated the cities were 5,000 stadia apart. Multiplying by 50 gave Earth's circumference as 250,000 stadia. Depending on exactly which version of the stadia measurement Eratosthenes used, this equals between 24,000 and 29,000 miles. The actual circumference is about 24,900 miles. Using nothing but shadows, mathematics, and the library's accumulated knowledge, Eratosthenes had measured the entire planet with remarkable accuracy. This achievement exemplified the library's approach to knowledge during its golden age. Scholars did not simply collect information, they synthesized it to answer fundamental questions. The library's vast collections allowed researchers to combine observations from different places and times, creating a collaborative intelligence that transcended any individual mind. A traveler's casual observation about shadows in Syene became scientifically significant when combined with geographical surveys and mathematical theory. While Eratosthenes calculated Earth's dimensions, another scholar named Aristarchus of Samos was using the library's astronomical texts to propose an even more radical idea. The conventional wisdom, supported by common sense and religious tradition, placed Earth at the center of the universe. The sun, moon, planets, and stars all revolved around humanity's home. But Aristarchus noticed mathematical patterns in planetary movements that suggested a different arrangement. By studying Babylonian astronomical records that the library had acquired at great expense, Aristarchus tracked the complex paths planets traced through the sky. Sometimes planets appeared to stop and move backward before resuming their forward motion. These retrograde movements were difficult to explain if planets simply circled Earth. But if Earth and the other planets orbited the Sun, The apparent backward motion could be explained as an optical illusion created when Earth overtook a slower-moving outer planet. Aristarchus wrote a treatise proposing that the Sun, not Earth, stood at the center of the cosmic system. Earth was merely another planet, spinning on its axis to create day and night while orbiting the Sun to produce the seasons. This heliocentric model simplified the mathematics of celestial motion and explained observations that had puzzled astronomers for centuries. But it also challenged fundamental assumptions about humanity's place in the universe. The reaction to Aristarchus's proposal revealed both the intellectual freedom and the ultimate limitations of Alexandrian scholarship. Within the library walls, scholars could debate any idea based on its logical merits and observational support. But outside, religious and philosophical authorities condemned the heliocentric theory as impious and absurd. How could Earth be moving when people felt no motion? Why would the gods place humanity anywhere but the center of creation? Even most astronomers rejected Aristarchus's model, not primarily for religious reasons, but because it seemed to contradict other observations. If Earth orbited the Sun, they argued, the positions of stars should shift slightly as Earth moved from one side of its orbit to the other. This stellar parallax was too small to detect with ancient instruments, but its apparent absence seemed to disprove the heliocentric theory. Aristarchus's correct insight would wait 18 centuries for vindication by Copernicus and Galileo. The medical texts in the library were producing more immediately practical revolutionary insights. Herophilus of Chalcedon, working in the early 3rd century BCE, had access to Egyptian medical papyri that described surgical procedures developed over thousands of years. But he also had something even more valuable: official permission to perform human dissections, a practice forbidden in most of the ancient world, but allowed in Alexandria under early Ptolemaic rule. Combining textual study with direct anatomical observation, Herophilus made discoveries that transformed medical understanding. He distinguished between sensory and motor nerves, traced the pathways of blood vessels, and provided the first accurate description of the human brain. He identified the brain, not the heart, as the seat of intelligence, contradicting Aristotle's teachings. His measurements of pulse rate introduced quantitative methods to medical diagnosis, using a water clock to time heartbeats with unprecedented precision. Herophilus's contemporary, Erasistratus of Chios, pushed medical investigation even further. He performed systematic experiments on living animals to understand physiological processes, developing early theories about digestion and circulation. He distinguished between veins and arteries, though he incorrectly believed arteries carried air rather than blood. His mechanical approach to biology, viewing the body as a complex machine governed by physical principles, influenced medical thinking for centuries. The library enabled these physicians to compare medical traditions from different cultures. Egyptian texts described surgical procedures and pharmaceutical preparations. Greek treatises emphasized theoretical understanding of disease. Mesopotamian tablets recorded correlations between celestial events and health patterns. By synthesizing these diverse approaches, Alexandrian physicians developed treatments that combined empirical observation with theoretical reasoning. The mechanical arts flourished alongside medicine and astronomy. Ctesibius of Alexandria, working around 250 BCE, invented devices that seemed to belong more to the modern world than to antiquity. His water clock used a float regulator to maintain constant water flow, achieving timekeeping accuracy that would not be surpassed until pendulum clocks appeared in the 17th century. He created the first keyboard instrument, a water organ called the hydraulis, which used water pressure to push air through pipes of different lengths. Ctesibius wrote detailed technical manuals that were preserved in the library, complete with engineering drawings and mathematical calculations. His work on pneumatics explored the properties of compressed air, describing pumps, siphons, and pressure vessels. He designed military machines, including an improved catapult that used bronze springs rather than twisted rope for power. His inventions demonstrated that theoretical knowledge could produce practical innovations that improved daily life and military capability. The library's workshops hummed with activity as craftsmen built models based on ancient texts and contemporary designs. They constructed astronomical instruments described in Babylonian tablets, tested medical devices mentioned in Egyptian papyri, and improved agricultural tools documented in Greek farming manuals. This hands-on experimentation distinguished Alexandrian science from pure philosophical speculation. Theories were tested against observation, and practical applications validated theoretical insights. Daily life in the Mausion followed rhythms established by generations of scholars. The day began before dawn with private study in individual chambers. Scholars would unroll scrolls by lamplight, taking notes on wax tablets or papyrus sheets. The morning hours were considered best for intense intellectual work, when minds were fresh and distractions minimal. Many scholars developed personal systems for organizing their research, creating indices and cross-references that helped them navigate the vast collections. Mid-morning brought the first communal gathering in the dining hall. Meals were simple but abundant, designed to sustain mental rather than physical labor. Conversation ranged from casual gossip about political events to heated debates about philosophical principles. The mixing of disciplines at these meals often sparked unexpected insights. A mathematician might suggest a solution to an astronomical problem. A poet might provide a metaphor that clarified a medical concept. After the morning meal, scholars often attended lectures or demonstrations. The library's lecture halls could accommodate hundreds of listeners, with stone benches arranged in semicircles around a central speaking platform. Visiting scholars presented their latest research, subjecting their ideas to rigorous questioning from the audience. These sessions could become contentious, with rival theories defended through logical argumentation and appeals to textual authority. The afternoon typically involved collaborative work. Scholars with complementary expertise would gather to tackle complex problems. Translators worked with subject matter experts to render foreign texts accurately. Mathematicians assisted astronomers with calculations. Poets consulted historians to ensure their epic narratives reflected actual events. This interdisciplinary cooperation produced synthetic works that drew on multiple domains of knowledge. The library employed a small army of support staff who made scholarly work possible. Professional scribes maintained the copying rooms, replacing worn scrolls and creating new editions of popular texts. Librarians managed the complex cataloging system, helping scholars locate specific works among hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Conservators repaired damaged papyri, using techniques developed over generations to restore texts that might otherwise be lost. The acquisition department continued its aggressive expansion of the collections. Agents traveled to book markets in Athens, Rome, and Carthage, competing with other libraries for rare texts. They cultivated relationships with private collectors, sometimes waiting years for the opportunity to purchase a coveted manuscript. The library paid premium prices for authenticated original works, especially those with annotations by famous scholars. Special collections required unique preservation methods. Mathematical texts often included diagrams that had to be copied precisely to maintain their meaning. Musical manuscripts used notation systems that few scribes understood. Medical texts sometimes included samples of dried herbs or mineral compounds mentioned in pharmaceutical recipes. Maps and astronomical charts required oversized storage areas and special handling procedures. The Serapeum, Alexandria's secondary library, served a different but equally important function. Located in the Egyptian quarter of the city, it was more accessible to the general population than the royal library. While the main library focused on research and preservation, the Serapeum emphasized education and public access. Students could consult reference works, attend introductory lectures, and begin their scholarly training before potentially being admitted to the Mausion. The Serapeum's collection, though smaller than the main libraries, was carefully curated for educational purposes. It contained standard editions of classic texts, introductory treatises on various subjects, and practical manuals for trades and professions. Physicians consulted medical references, engineers reviewed technical specifications, and merchants studied commercial law. The Serapeum democratized knowledge to an extent unprecedented in the ancient world. Religious texts occupied a special section of the Serapeum, reflecting Alexandria's diverse population. Greek myths and philosophical treatises sat alongside Egyptian religious papyri and Jewish scriptural commentaries. This proximity of different traditions occasionally caused tension, but also enabled comparative religious studies. Scholars began to identify common themes across cultures, noting similar flood narratives, creation stories, and moral teachings. The relationship between the two libraries resembled that of a research university and a public library in modern times. Advanced scholars worked primarily at the main library, pushing the boundaries of knowledge. Students and citizens used the Serapeum for education and practical information. Texts were regularly copied from the main collection to the Serapeum, making important works more widely available while preserving fragile originals. Security measures protected both facilities from theft and damage. Guards controlled access to the most valuable scrolls, which were stored in special chambers with limited entry. Scholars had to request specific texts through librarians who verified their credentials and recorded which scrolls they consulted. Fire posed the greatest threat, leading to elaborate precautions including water reservoirs, sand supplies, and strict rules about lamp usage. Despite these precautions, minor incidents occurred regularly. Scholars occasionally attempted to smuggle out rare texts, hiding scrolls in their robes or substituting forgeries for originals. Accidents damaged irreplaceable manuscripts when ink was spilled or scrolls were torn through careless handling. Small fires broke out in copying rooms where lamps were used for illumination. Each incident led to refined procedures and increased vigilance. The library's influence on the Greek language itself was profound. Alexandrian scholars standardized spelling and grammar, creating authoritative editions that became models for proper Greek usage. They developed accent marks and punctuation systems that made texts easier to read accurately. Their commentaries explained obscure words and phrases, preserving the meaning of ancient texts for future generations. Literary criticism emerged as a distinct discipline within the library's walls. Scholars analyzed poetic meter, narrative structure, and rhetorical techniques. They compared different versions of epic poems, attempting to determine which lines were original and which were later additions. They wrote detailed commentaries that explained historical references, mythological allusions, and geographical descriptions. These scholarly apparatus transformed reading from passive consumption to active interpretation. The library's scholars also recognized the importance of performance in understanding certain texts. They organized readings of poetry with musical accompaniment, attempting to recreate the original context of epic recitations. Dramatic works were sometimes staged in the Mousseon's gardens, allowing scholars to study how physical movement and vocal delivery affected meaning. These performances were not mere entertainment, but serious scholarly investigations into the relationship between text and presentation. Scientific instruments accumulated alongside texts, creating a three-dimensional library of technological knowledge. Astronomical devices from Babylon, surgical tools from Egypt, and navigation instruments from Phoenicia were studied and improved. Scholars wrote detailed descriptions of these artifacts, explaining their construction and use. Some instruments were so complex that understanding them required extensive study of associated texts. The library's influence reached into every aspect of Alexandrian life. Legal scholars consulted precedents from different judicial systems when advising the Ptolemaic court. Agricultural experts reviewed farming techniques from various climates to improve Egyptian harvests. Military engineers studied siege warfare tactics from historical accounts. The boundary between theoretical knowledge and practical application remained deliberately porous. International correspondence networks developed around the library. Scholars maintained relationships with colleagues in Athens, Pergamon, and other intellectual centers. They exchanged letters discussing research problems, shared discoveries, and debated theoretical questions. These letters, often copied and preserved in the library, provide insights into the collaborative nature of ancient scholarship. Knowledge was not hoarded but shared among those deemed worthy of participation in the scholarly community. The economic impact of this intellectual activity was substantial. Alexandria became the ancient world's publishing center, with hundreds of scribes producing copies for export. The book trade generated significant tax revenue for the Ptolemaic dynasty. Wealthy Romans began sending their sons to Alexandria for education, paying substantial fees that supported the library's operations. The city's reputation for learning attracted merchants, diplomats, and cultural tourists who contributed to its prosperity. Yet beneath this prosperity lay fundamental tensions that would eventually contribute to the library's decline. The cost of maintaining such an institution was enormous, requiring consistent royal patronage that depended on political stability. The integration of different cultural traditions created philosophical and religious conflicts that peaceful scholarship could not always resolve. The very success of the library in accumulating knowledge made it a target for those who feared or resented Ptolemaic power. As the 2nd century BCE progressed, these tensions remained manageable. The library continued to grow and prosper under successive Ptolemaic rulers who understood its value. Scholars continued to make discoveries that advanced human understanding. The collections continued to expand through purchase, copying, and confiscation. The Library of Alexandria stood as proof that knowledge from different times and cultures could be preserved, studied, and synthesized to produce new insights. No institution lasts forever, but in its golden age, the library seemed to transcend the normal cycles of growth and decay that affected human enterprises. It had become more than a collection of scrolls or a community of scholars. It represented an ideal that knowledge was universal, that wisdom transcended political boundaries, that human understanding could progress through systematic investigation. This ideal would survive even when the physical library perished, inspiring future generations to rebuild what was lost and continue the eternal human quest for understanding. The first signs of trouble appeared during a royal wedding feast in 145 BCE. Ptolemy VIII, Physcon, whose nickname meant potbelly in Greek, sat on the throne beside his new bride, who was also his niece and former sister-in-law. The marriage had sparked outrage among Alexandria's citizens, but the scholars of the Mausion had remained carefully neutral, focusing on their research rather than palace intrigue. That neutrality would soon prove impossible to maintain. Ptolemy VIII had seized power through a bloody civil war against his brother Ptolemy VI, and paranoia consumed him from his first day as pharaoh. He saw enemies everywhere, particularly among the educated elite who had supported his brother's more enlightened rule. The scholars of the library, with their foreign connections and independent thinking, represented everything the new king feared. They corresponded with intellectuals in rival kingdoms, possessed knowledge that could challenge royal propaganda, and worst of all, they remembered better times under previous rulers. The purge began subtly at first. Funding for new acquisitions decreased, while royal officials began questioning library expenditures that had never been scrutinized before. Scholars who criticized the regime in private conversations found their research privileges restricted. Foreign visitors faced increasingly hostile interrogations about their purposes in Alexandria. The atmosphere of free intellectual inquiry that had defined the Mausion for generations grew thick with suspicion and fear. Then came the massacre. During a public festival in 145 BCE, Ptolemy VIII's soldiers surrounded the gymnasium where many young Alexandrian intellectuals had gathered. On the king's orders, they slaughtered hundreds of the city's brightest minds, particularly those associated with the Mausion and library. Blood ran through the streets where philosophical debates had once echoed. The message was clear to any scholar who survived. Knowledge that did not serve the king was dangerous. The exodus that followed devastated Alexandrian intellectual life more than any fire could have. Leading scholars fled to Athens, Pergamon, and Rhodes, carrying with them not physical scrolls, but something equally valuable, the methodologies and traditions that had made the library great. Aristarchus of Samothrace, the head librarian and greatest literary critic of his age, escaped to Cyprus, where he continued his work in exile until his death. His departure marked the end of serious textual scholarship in Alexandria for a generation. Those scholars who remained learned to practice a different kind of research. Rather than pursuing truth wherever it led, they focused on subjects that pleased their violent patron. Astronomical observations continued because predicting eclipses enhanced royal prestige. Medical research proceeded because the king needed physicians. But philosophical inquiries that might question the justice of absolute rule ceased entirely. The library still functioned, but its soul had fled with the exiled scholars. The damage Ptolemy VIII inflicted was not merely intellectual but institutional. He appointed loyal but mediocre administrators to run the library, men who cared more about political reliability than scholarly achievement. The rigorous standards for acquiring and copying texts relaxed. Forgeries and inferior copies entered the collection unchallenged. The careful cataloguing system that Callimachus had established fell into disarray as experienced librarians were replaced by political appointees. Yet even in this diminished state, the library remained the ancient world's greatest repository of knowledge. Its collections had grown so vast over the previous century and a half that even neglect and mismanagement could not quickly destroy what generations had built. Scholars from across the Mediterranean still came to consult texts available nowhere else. The copying rooms still produced editions for export, though with less attention to accuracy than before. The library's survival through this period owed much to its sheer inertia. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls could not simply disappear overnight. The physical infrastructure of storage rooms, reading halls, and copying facilities remained intact. Most importantly, enough junior scholars and scribes remained to maintain basic operations. They preserved what they could, waiting for better times that they hoped would eventually come. Those better times seemed to arrive when Ptolemy VIII died in 116 BCE, but the dynasty had been fundamentally weakened. Succession disputes became the norm rather than the exception. Each new ruler viewed the library primarily as a symbol of legitimacy rather than a functioning research institution. They would be crowned in elaborate ceremonies at the Mausion, invoking the glory of their ancestors, then ignore the institution until the next crisis required its symbolic authority. Meanwhile, a new rival had emerged to challenge Alexandria's intellectual supremacy. The Kingdom of Pergamon in Asia Minor had established its own library that explicitly competed with Alexandria for texts, scholars, and prestige. The Attalid dynasty that ruled Pergamon poured resources into their library, offering generous salaries to lure scholars away from an increasingly unstable Alexandria. They developed new technologies, most notably replacing papyrus with parchment, processed animal skin that was more durable and could be written on both sides. The rivalry between the two libraries became legendary. According to ancient accounts, the Ptolemies became so concerned about Pergamon's growing collection that they banned the export of papyrus, hoping to cripple their rivals' ability to produce books. The Pergamenes responded by perfecting parchment production, turning a temporary setback into a technological advancement. Whether this trade embargo actually occurred, or was merely a story to explain parchment's development, it illustrates the intense competition for intellectual dominance. Athens, the traditional center of Greek philosophy, also experienced a revival during Alexandria's troubles. The academy that Plato had founded and the Lyceum of Aristotle attracted students who might once have gone to Alexandria. Smaller but focused libraries in Rhodes and Antioch gained prominence. The decentralization of knowledge that Alexandria had reversed was beginning to reassert itself. The Roman Republic watched these developments with interest. Roman nobles had begun to appreciate Greek learning, sending their sons to study philosophy and rhetoric in the Greek East. They collected Greek texts for their private libraries and competed to patronize Greek intellectuals. As Roman power expanded across the Mediterranean, it was only a matter of time before Rome would directly intervene in Egypt's increasingly chaotic affairs. That intervention came through one of history's most famous love affairs. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria pursuing his rival Pompey, who had fled there after losing the civil war. But Pompey was already dead, assassinated on the orders of young Ptolemy VIII, who hoped to curry favor with Caesar. Instead, Caesar found himself drawn into a dynastic dispute between Ptolemy VIII and his sister Cleopatra VII, who believed she was the rightful ruler of Egypt. Cleopatra was unlike any woman Caesar had encountered. Educated in the Mausion, she spoke 9 languages and had studied mathematics, rhetoric, and philosophy. Ancient sources describe her intelligence and charm rather than exceptional beauty. She understood that knowledge was power in a very literal sense, using her education to navigate the treacherous waters of late Ptolemaic politics. When she famously had herself smuggled to Caesar rolled up in a carpet or bed linens, she was deploying theatrical skills learned from studying Greek drama in the library's collections. Caesar sided with Cleopatra, and Ptolemy VIII's forces besieged them in the royal quarter of Alexandria where the library stood. The fighting that followed would inflict the first major physical damage on the great library. Caesar's troops, vastly outnumbered, set fire to the Egyptian fleet in the harbor to prevent enemy reinforcements. The flames spread from the docks to nearby warehouses and from there to parts of the city. Ancient accounts differ dramatically about what happened next. Julius Caesar himself, writing in his commentaries on the Civil War, never mentions the library being damaged, but Plutarch, writing over a century later, claims that the fire destroyed the great library entirely. Dio Cassius provides a middle position, suggesting that warehouses containing books awaiting cataloguing were burned, but the main library survived. Modern historians generally believe that the fire destroyed a significant but not devastating portion of the library's holdings. Perhaps 40,000 scrolls were lost, mainly recent acquisitions stored near the harbor or copies intended for export. The main collections, housed in stone buildings within the palace complex, likely survived intact. The fact that scholars continued to work at the library for centuries afterward suggests that the damage, while serious, was not catastrophic. Yet the fire marked a psychological turning point. The library's aura of invulnerability had been shattered. If Roman military action could accidentally destroy thousands of irreplaceable texts, what might deliberate attack accomplish? The scholars who witnessed smoke rising from burning scrolls understood that knowledge accumulated over centuries could vanish in moments. This fragility had always existed, but now it was undeniable. Cleopatra, once secure on her throne with Caesar's support, worked to restore the library's prestige. She understood that Alexandria's intellectual reputation enhanced her own authority. Ancient sources claim that Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant, and later Cleopatra's lover, presented her with 200,000 scrolls from the Library of Pergamon as a gift. This massive transfer, if it actually occurred, would have more than compensated for the losses from Caesar's fire. But the story of the Pergamon gift raises numerous questions. The logistics of transporting 200,000 scrolls across the Mediterranean would have been staggering. Pergamon's rulers would hardly have surrendered their entire collection willingly. Some historians suggest the gift was smaller, perhaps rare texts, rather than an entire library. Others believed the story was propaganda, either inflating a modest gift or invented entirely to demonstrate Antony's devotion to Cleopatra. What seems certain is that Cleopatra invested heavily in the library during her reign. She appointed competent administrators, restored funding for acquisitions, and encouraged scholarship that had languished during the previous decades of civil strife. She herself participated in scholarly activities, writing treatises on cosmetics, medicine, and mathematics, though none of these works survive. Her court attracted intellectuals who saw in her a return to the enlightened patronage of earlier Ptolemaic rulers. The collaboration between Cleopatra and her scholars produced practical innovations alongside theoretical advances. Alexandrian engineers developed improved irrigation systems for the Nile Valley, increasing agricultural yields that funded the kingdom's revival. Astronomers refined calendar calculations that helped predict the Nile's annual flooding. Physicians synthesized Greek and Egyptian medical knowledge to treat the diseases that plagued Alexandria's dense urban population. But this renaissance was built on unstable foundations. Cleopatra's alliance with Mark Antony placed her in opposition to Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and rival for control of Rome. The propaganda war between them was as fierce as their military conflict. Octavian portrayed Cleopatra as a seductress who had corrupted noble Romans with oriental decadence. The library, as a symbol of Greek and Egyptian learning, became associated with foreign influences that threatened Roman virtue. The decisive battle at Actium in 31 BCE sealed both Cleopatra's fate and the library's transformation. Antony and Cleopatra's defeat meant that Egypt would become a Roman province, ending 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. Octavian, soon to become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, entered Alexandria as a conqueror. The scholars of the library waited anxiously to learn whether he would preserve or punish the institution that had served his enemies. Augustus proved surprisingly benevolent toward the library, recognizing its value as a repository of useful knowledge. But he fundamentally altered its character. Rather than an independent research institution pursuing knowledge for its own sake, it became an imperial resource serving Roman interests. Scholars were encouraged to focus on practical subjects like geography, engineering, and administration that would benefit the empire. Philosophical speculation that might question imperial authority was discouraged. The library's acquisition policies shifted to reflect Roman priorities. Latin texts began to enter the collection, though Greek remained the primary scholarly language. Works on Roman law, military tactics, and administration received emphasis. The systematic translation projects that had once brought Egyptian and Hebrew texts into Greek now focused on making Greek knowledge accessible to Latin-speaking Romans. Physical changes to the library reflected its new status. Roman architectural elements were added to the Mausion complex. Security increased, with Roman soldiers replacing the relatively light Egyptian guard. Access became more restricted, with Roman officials deciding which scholars could consult sensitive texts. The democratic ideal of knowledge available to all qualified scholars gave way to imperial control of information. The Serapeum, the public library that had served Alexandria's general population, maintained more independence initially. Located in the Egyptian quarter and associated with the Temple of Serapis, it remained a center of traditional learning. Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, and Jewish scholars continued to study and teach there. But it too would eventually face Roman pressure to conform to imperial expectations. Competition from other libraries continued to challenge Alexandria's supremacy. The library at Pergamon, despite the alleged gift to Cleopatra, recovered and continued operating. Athens maintained its philosophical schools with their specialized collections. Rome itself was developing major libraries, with Augustus establishing 2 public libraries that would become models for others throughout the empire. Perhaps more significantly, private collections were proliferating among wealthy Romans. These personal libraries, while smaller than Alexandria's, were often more accessible to the scholars who used them. A philosopher enjoying a patron's hospitality could consult their host's collection at leisure without the bureaucratic obstacles that increasingly hampered access to the great library. The decentralization of knowledge that the library had been created to prevent was accelerating. The scholarly methodology was also fragmenting. The rigorous textual criticism that Alexandrian scholars had pioneered gave way to different approaches in different places. Roman scholars were more interested in practical application than theoretical precision. Religious communities began to prioritize texts that supported their theological positions over those that challenged them. The unified intellectual culture that the library had fostered was dividing along political, cultural, and religious lines. Yet even in decline, the library retained immense cultural authority. To be educated in Alexandria still carried prestige throughout the Mediterranean world. Scholars still dreamed of accessing texts available nowhere else. The title of head librarian, though now largely ceremonial, remained one of the highest intellectual honors in the ancient world. The idea of the library, as much as its physical reality, continued to inspire those who valued knowledge. The preservation work continued, though with less systematic rigor than before. Scribes still copied deteriorating papyri onto fresh materials. Scholars still compiled commentaries and summaries of important works. The catalogue, though no longer comprehensive, still guided researchers to texts they sought. The daily routine of reading, copying, and discussing texts proceeded much as it had for centuries, even as the institutional framework weakened. Trade in books remained a significant part of Alexandria's economy. The city's scribes had unmatched expertise in producing high-quality copies, even if they no longer had exclusive access to the best originals. Wealthy collectors from across the empire commissioned Alexandrian editions of classic texts. The book trade adapted to changing demands, producing more Latin works and practical manuals alongside traditional Greek literature and philosophy. The relationship between the library and Alexandria's diverse religious communities grew more complex under Roman rule. The large Jewish population had always used the library while maintaining their own religious texts and traditions. Egyptian priests preserved sacred knowledge that they shared selectively with Greek scholars. Mystery religions from across the eastern Mediterranean established themselves in Alexandria, each with their own texts and interpretive traditions. These parallel knowledge systems sometimes enriched the library's collections through exchange and translation, but they also created tensions as different groups claimed exclusive access to truth. The syncretistic tendency of Ptolemaic times, which had sought to harmonize different traditions, gave way to sharper boundaries between communities. Knowledge became increasingly sectarian, with each group guarding its particular wisdom. The first century of Roman rule saw the library functioning but diminished, respected but no longer revolutionary. It had become one of many centers of learning rather than the unique institution it had once been. The vast collections remained, and scholars continued to consult them, but the creative energy that had produced groundbreaking discoveries had largely dissipated. The library was becoming a monument to past achievement rather than an engine of future progress. Looking back, the period from Ptolemy VIII's persecutions to the establishment of Roman rule marked the library's transformation from a living institution to a historical artifact. The political intrigue, civil wars, and changing rulers had disrupted the continuity of scholarship that had been the library's greatest strength. The fire during Caesar's siege, whether destroying thousands or tens of thousands of scrolls, had demonstrated the collection's vulnerability. The shift from Ptolemaic to Roman control had fundamentally altered the library's mission and methods. Yet, through all these troubles, the library survived, damaged, diminished, and transformed, but still standing. The scrolls still lined the shelves, the scholars still pursued their research, the scribes still copied texts. The dream of universal knowledge had faded, but the reality of an enormous collection of human wisdom remained. That collection would continue to serve scholars for centuries more, even as new threats emerged that would ultimately accomplish what political intrigue and accidental fires had not: the complete destruction of the ancient world's greatest library. The Roman Emperor Augustus understood that controlling Egypt meant more than collecting grain tributes and tax revenues. When he stood in the Great Hall of the Mausoleum in 30 BCE, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of scrolls, he recognized an instrument of power more subtle, but potentially more influential than any legion. Knowledge could legitimize empire, transform barbarians into citizens, and provide solutions to the practical problems of governing millions across 3 continents. Augustus approached the library with the calculated pragmatism that characterized all his reforms. He maintained funding, but redirected scholarly priorities toward imperial needs. Geographers received commissions to map frontier regions where Roman armies might soon march. Historians were encouraged to document the civil wars in ways that justified Augustus's victory and one-man rule. Agricultural experts studied crop yields and irrigation techniques that could increase the grain supply to feed Rome's growing population. The emperor appointed Chaeremon of Alexandria as head librarian, a choice that revealed his priorities. Chaeremon was a Stoic philosopher who believed that Egyptian hieroglyphics contained profound wisdom expressed through symbolic imagery. His appointment signaled respect for Egyptian tradition while ensuring loyalty to Roman power. He wrote extensively on hieroglyphics, comets, and Egyptian history, but always within frameworks that supported imperial ideology. Under Chaeremon's leadership, the library developed new sections devoted to Roman administrative knowledge. Texts on provincial governance, tax collection, and military logistics filled newly constructed storage rooms. The correspondence of Roman governors was collected and copied, creating an archive of imperial decision-making that administrators could consult when facing similar challenges. The library was becoming not just a repository of ancient wisdom, but a training ground for imperial bureaucrats. Yet alongside this practical transformation, remarkable innovation continued in mathematics and engineering. Heron of Alexandria, working in the 1st century CE, embodied the Roman period's blend of theoretical brilliance and practical application. His mathematical texts advanced geometric theory, while his engineering works described machines that seemed to belong to a different age entirely. In the library's workshops, Heron constructed devices that would not be reinvented for more than a millennium. His most famous creation was the Aeolipile, a primitive steam engine that demonstrated the power of heated water vapor to create motion. A sealed cauldron with 2 bent tubes could spin rapidly when steam escaped, proving that heat could be converted into mechanical work. Heron understood the principles that would eventually power the Industrial Revolution, but in an economy based on slave labor, there was little incentive to develop labor-saving machinery. His steam engine remained a curiosity, a demonstration of nature's hidden forces rather than a practical tool. More immediately useful were Heron's automatic devices that created wonder in temples and theaters. He designed temple doors that opened automatically when a fire was lit on an altar, using heated air to displace water that powered hidden mechanisms. He created mechanical theaters where tiny figures acted out plays, powered by falling sand that turned gears and pulled strings. These automata demonstrated divine power to worshippers who did not understand the hidden machinery, strengthening religious authority through technological illusion. Heron's texts, preserved in the library, provided detailed instructions for constructing these devices. His Pneumatica described over 70 different mechanisms using air pressure, water displacement, and steam power. His Automatopoietic explained how to build self-moving machines that could pour wine, play music, or simulate animal movements. These works combined precise mathematical calculations with practical engineering advice, representing a synthesis of Greek theory and Roman pragmatism. The library's medical texts were producing equally remarkable advances. Physicians had access to centuries of accumulated knowledge from Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia. They compared different treatments for the same ailments, tested pharmaceutical preparations described in ancient texts, and developed new surgical techniques. The Roman peace allowed medical knowledge to spread more rapidly than ever before, with physicians trained in Alexandria practicing throughout the empire. Dioscorides, a Greek physician in the Roman army, compiled his De Materia Medica using the library's botanical and pharmaceutical texts. His work described over 600 medicinal plants, their preparation, and therapeutic uses. For each plant, he provided multiple names in different languages, allowing physicians across the empire to identify local sources. This systematic approach to pharmacology would remain the standard medical reference for over 1,500 years, copied and recopied in languages from Arabic to Anglo-Saxon. The Emperor Claudius took particular interest in the library during his reign from 41 to 54 CE. As a scholar himself who had written histories of Carthage and Etruria, Claudius understood the value of preserving knowledge. He added a new wing to the Mausion, specifically designed to house his own historical works and those of other Roman authors. This Claudian addition marked the library's evolution from a purely Greek institution to a truly multicultural repository. Claudius also instituted annual public readings where his historical works would be recited in the library's lecture halls. These sessions were mandatory for court officials, ensuring that imperial interpretation of history reached the educated elite. The library was becoming an instrument of propaganda as much as preservation, shaping historical memory to serve present power. Yet scholars continued to maintain alternative narratives in texts that were copied but not publicly proclaimed. The first century also saw increasing interaction between pagan philosophers and the growing Christian community in Alexandria. The city had one of the largest Jewish populations in the ancient world, and from this community emerged some of the earliest Christian theologians. These scholars faced a unique challenge in reconciling their faith, rooted in Hebrew scripture, with the Greek philosophical tradition that dominated intellectual discourse. Philo of Alexandria, though Jewish rather than Christian, pioneered the allegorical interpretation that would become central to Christian theology. Working in the library during the early 1st century, he argued that Hebrew scripture contained philosophical truths expressed through symbolic narratives. His method allowed educated Jews and later Christians to maintain their religious traditions while engaging with Greek philosophy. The library's collections enabled him to quote extensively from both Hebrew texts and Greek philosophers, creating synthetic works that bridged cultural divides. The Apostle Mark, according to Christian tradition, established the Church of Alexandria around 42 CE. The Christian community that developed there was uniquely intellectual, influenced by the scholarly atmosphere of the city. Christian scribes began producing copies of Gospels and epistles with the same careful attention to textual accuracy that characterized the library's secular copying rooms. They developed their own libraries and schools, parallel to but separate from the pagan institutions. By the 2nd century, Christian scholars were openly debating pagan philosophers in the library's lecture halls. These discussions were not always peaceful disagreements over abstract theology. They involved fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the source of moral authority, and the meaning of human existence. Pagan philosophers argued that Christianity was an irrational superstition that rejected the logical inquiry Greece had perfected. Christians responded that pagan philosophy, for all its sophistication, had failed to provide moral guidance or spiritual satisfaction. The library became a battlefield for these intellectual conflicts, though the weapons were words rather than swords. Justin Martyr, a Christian philosopher, used his extensive knowledge of Greek philosophy to argue that Plato and other pagan thinkers had glimpsed truths that were fully revealed in Christianity. His opponents countered that Christians selectively quoted philosophical texts out of context, distorting their meaning to support predetermined conclusions. Gnosticism added another layer of complexity to these debates. Gnostic teachers like Valentinus and Basilides developed elaborate cosmological systems that combined Christian, Jewish, Greek, and Egyptian elements. They used the library's diverse collections to support their synthetic theologies, finding hidden meanings in texts from every tradition. Orthodox Christians and pagan philosophers often found themselves allied against Gnostic interpretations. They both considered dangerous distortions. The library's role in preserving and transmitting texts became crucial for these religious debates. Different versions of the same gospel circulated, with variations that could support different theological positions. Scholars compared manuscripts, trying to determine which readings were original and which were later alterations. The textual criticism techniques developed for Homer and Plato were now applied to Matthew and Paul, creating new controversies about the authority of Scripture. Origen of Alexandria, working in the early 3rd century, represented the pinnacle of Christian scholarship in the ancient library. His hexapla placed 6 different versions of Hebrew scripture in parallel columns, allowing detailed comparison of textual variations. This massive work, which filled over 6,000 pages, could only have been produced with access to the library's extensive collections. Origen's careful scholarship established principles of biblical interpretation that influenced Christian thought for centuries. But Origen's work also demonstrated the growing tension between Christian faith and classical learning. He was eventually condemned as a heretic for ideas influenced by Platonic philosophy, such as the pre-existence of souls and the eventual salvation of all beings, including Satan. His fate illustrated the increasing difficulty of maintaining the library's tradition of open inquiry in an age of hardening religious orthodoxy. The material culture of texts was also changing during the Roman period. Parchment, made from treated animal skin, was gradually replacing papyrus as the preferred writing material. Parchment was more durable, could be written on both sides, and could be scraped clean and reused. But it was also more expensive, requiring the skins of dozens of animals for a single large text. This economic pressure led to more selective copying, with only the most valued works transferred to the new medium. The codex, similar to a modern book with bound pages, began to replace the scroll as the standard format for texts. Christians particularly favored the codex because it allowed easier reference to specific passages and could contain longer works in a single volume. The 4 Gospels could fit in one codex, while they required multiple scrolls. This technological shift had profound implications for how knowledge was organized and accessed. The library struggled to adapt to these changes. Its vast collection of papyrus scrolls was becoming increasingly fragile and difficult to use. Converting hundreds of thousands of scrolls to parchment codices would have been prohibitively expensive and time-consuming. Many texts were simply not copied into the new format, surviving only as deteriorating papyrus that became harder to read with each passing decade. The preservation crisis that had always threatened the library was accelerating. Administrative changes under Roman rule further complicated the library's operations. The position of head librarian became increasingly ceremonial, with real power residing with Roman officials who controlled funding and access. The international community of scholars that had characterized the Ptolemaic period gave way to an increasingly Roman and Christian institution. Jewish scholars faced growing restrictions, particularly after the Jewish revolts against Roman rule in the 1st and 2nd centuries. The Emperor Hadrian visited Alexandria in 130 CE and took great interest in the library. He engaged in philosophical debates with scholars and commissioned new building projects in the city. But his visit also demonstrated the library's diminished status. Where Ptolemaic rulers had been resident patrons who regularly consulted the collections, Roman emperors were distant figures who might visit once in a generation. The library had become a prestigious but peripheral institution in an empire centered on Rome. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, appointed skilled administrators and maintained funding during his reign from 161 to 180 CE. His own Meditations, though written in Greek, reflected the Stoic philosophy that had become dominant among educated Romans. The library's collections of Stoic texts were expanded and carefully maintained, while works from competing philosophical schools received less attention. Knowledge was increasingly filtered through imperial preferences. The Antonine Plague, which struck the empire during Marcus Aurelius's reign, had devastating effects on Alexandria and its scholarly community. Modern historians believe it was likely smallpox or measles, diseases that killed millions across the empire. The dense urban environment of Alexandria, with scholars from across the known world gathering in close quarters, made the library community particularly vulnerable. Many scholars died or fled, disrupting the continuity of teaching and research that had sustained the institution for centuries. Economic pressures also mounted during the 2nd century. The cost of maintaining buildings, paying salaries, and acquiring new texts strained imperial resources already stretched by military campaigns and public works. The library competed for funding with newer institutions in Rome, Athens, and Constantinople. Provincial governors who might once have donated texts to Alexandria now established libraries in their own cities, seeking local prestige rather than contributing to universal knowledge. The quality of scholarship declined as political and economic pressures increased. Where earlier librarians had been leading researchers who advanced their fields while managing the collections, later appointees were often bureaucrats with little scholarly background. The rigorous peer review that had characterized Alexandrian scholarship gave way to uncritical acceptance of texts that supported imperial or religious authority. Forgeries and interpolations entered the collection without the careful scrutiny that earlier generations had applied. Yet even in decline, the library remained an essential resource for certain types of knowledge. Medical texts from centuries of practice were available nowhere else in such concentration. Mathematical and astronomical works preserved observations and calculations that scholars still consulted. Historical records documented events and cultures that would otherwise be forgotten. The library was no longer producing much new knowledge, but it was still preserving old wisdom that might otherwise be lost. The relationship between the library and the Serapeum was also changing. As the main library became more restricted and Roman-controlled, the Serapeum gained importance as a center for traditional learning. Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, and increasingly marginalized Jewish scholars found the Serapeum more welcoming than the imperial institution. This division would have profound consequences as religious conflicts intensified in the coming centuries. International trade in books continued, but with different patterns than before. Alexandria was no longer the dominant source of high-quality texts, competing with scriptoria in Rome, Athens, and Antioch. The city's scribes increasingly produced popular works for general consumption rather than scholarly editions for libraries. Religious texts, both Christian and pagan, became more profitable than philosophical treatises or scientific works. The Roman period also saw the development of specialized libraries within Alexandria. Christian churches established their own collections focused on scripture and theological works. Jewish synagogues maintained libraries of Hebrew texts and commentaries. Pagan temples preserved mystery texts and ritual instructions. The universal library that the Ptolemies had envisioned was fragmenting into sectarian collections that rarely shared resources or insights. Legal texts gained new prominence under Roman rule. The library collected imperial edicts, senatorial decrees, and provincial laws. Roman jurists consulted precedents from across the empire, developing the systematic legal framework that would become one of Rome's most enduring legacies. The library's legal collection influenced the development of Roman law, which in turn would shape legal systems across Europe for millennia. The practical focus of Roman-era scholarship extended to technology and engineering. Texts described aqueduct construction, road building, and military fortifications. The library became a resource for imperial projects, providing technical knowledge for administrators and engineers. This practical knowledge was valuable, but it represented a narrowing of the library's original vision of preserving all human knowledge regardless of immediate utility. By the end of the 2nd century CE, the Library of Alexandria had been transformed almost beyond recognition from its Ptolemaic origins. It was now a Roman institution serving imperial interests, a Christian battleground for theological disputes, and a deteriorating collection of ancient scrolls that fewer scholars could read. The universal ideal had given way to particular interests, the pursuit of truth had yielded to the defense of orthodoxy, and the community of international scholars had fragmented into competing schools. Yet the collection itself remained vast and valuable. Hundreds of thousands of texts still filled the storage rooms, even if many were deteriorating beyond readability. The institutional knowledge of how to preserve, copy, and catalogue texts persisted, even if practiced with less rigor than before. The idea of a great library preserving human knowledge continued to inspire, even if the reality fell short of the ideal. The seeds of destruction were clearly visible, but the final catastrophe still lay in the future, waiting for the perfect storm of religious violence, economic collapse, and simple neglect that would finally destroy what the Ptolemies had built and the Romans had transformed. The 3rd century began with an ominous visit from Emperor Caracalla in 215 CE. He arrived in Alexandria claiming to honor Alexander the Great, whose tomb still stood in the city center. The young emperor fancied himself a new Alexander, destined to conquer the East and surpass his hero's achievements. But beneath this theatrical admiration lay a paranoid fury that would unleash unprecedented violence on the city that had preserved Alexander's legacy through its scholarship. Caracalla had heard that Alexandrian satirists were mocking him in their theatres and lecture halls. They composed witty epigrams about his murder of his brother Geta, questioning how someone who killed his own blood could claim Alexander's mantle. These verses spread through the city's educated population, copied and shared in the same rooms where Homer's epics were studied. The boundary between scholarly discourse and political commentary had always been porous in Alexandria, but now that porosity would prove fatal. The emperor invited the city's young men to assemble in the stadium, promising to form them into a new phalanx in honor of Alexander's Macedonian warriors. Thousands gathered, including many students and junior scholars from the Mauseon. As they stood in formation expecting to receive weapons and honors, Caracalla gave a different signal. Roman soldiers surrounded the stadium and began a systematic massacre. For days, the killing continued throughout the city, targeting especially the educated youth who formed the next generation of scholars. The library lost irreplaceable human capital in those bloody days. Young men who had spent years learning to read hieroglyphics, studying mathematical proofs, or mastering the nuances of textual criticism were cut down in moments. The careful transmission of knowledge from master to student, which had continued for 5 centuries, was severed. Entire areas of specialized knowledge died with their practitioners, leaving texts that no one could fully understand. The massacre's effects extended beyond the immediate deaths. Many scholars fled Alexandria, taking whatever texts they could carry, but leaving behind the collaborative environment essential for advanced research. The international character of the scholarly community, already weakened by Roman provincial attitudes, collapsed entirely. Who would send their sons to study in a city where imperial whim could mean death? The flow of students that had sustained the library for generations reduced to a trickle. Those who remained worked in an atmosphere of fear and resignation. The playful intellectual debates that had characterized the Mauseon were replaced by careful, orthodox discussions that avoided any topic that might be construed as criticism. Satire and comedy, once used to make philosophical points memorable, disappeared from scholarly discourse. The library became a place of quiet preservation rather than vibrant discovery, maintaining old knowledge without the confidence to create new insights. The economic chaos that followed Caracalla's reign compounded the library's problems. The Roman Empire entered what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of civil wars, currency devaluation, and economic collapse. Between 235 and 284 CE, over 20 emperors claimed power, most ruling for only months before being murdered by rivals or their own troops. The stable funding that had maintained the library for centuries evaporated as competing claimants demanded immediate resources for military campaigns. Hyperinflation destroyed the purchasing power of the library's endowments. Where once generous salaries had attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean, now stipends barely covered basic food costs. The price of papyrus and parchment skyrocketed, making new acquisitions impossible and even routine copying prohibitively expensive. Scribes abandoned their posts for more lucrative work, leaving texts uncopied as older scrolls deteriorated beyond salvage. The building maintenance that preserved delicate papyrus from Alexandria's humidity was neglected. Roofs leaked during winter rains, destroying entire sections of scrolls. Insects invaded storage rooms that were no longer regularly treated with protective oils. Salt air from the nearby harbor corroded metal clasps and fittings, causing scrolls to fall from their containers and scatter across floors where they were trampled by anyone searching for other texts. In 269 CE, Alexandria faced a new threat when Queen Zenobia of Palmyra conquered Egypt as part of her breakaway empire. Palmyra had its own scholarly traditions, influenced by both Greek and Persian learning, and Zenobia herself was educated and cultured. She claimed to be protecting the eastern provinces from Germanic invasions that the weakened Roman Empire could not repel. But her occupation of Alexandria brought fresh disruptions to the already struggling library. Palmyrene officials, unfamiliar with the library's complex organization, demanded inventories of valuable texts that might be sent back to Palmyra. Scholars were forced to create lists of their collections, revealing rare works that had been quietly preserved through earlier crises. Some of these texts disappeared during the occupation, either confiscated by Palmyrene authorities or hidden by librarians who feared their loss. The catalogue system, already deteriorating, fell into complete disorder as scrolls were moved, hidden, or lost. The brief Palmyrene occupation ended when Emperor Aurelian reconquered Egypt in 273 CE, but the fighting caused additional damage. Street battles between Roman and Palmyrene forces spread through the royal quarter where the library stood. Fire, that constant threat to ancient libraries, once again consumed portions of the collection. While not as devastating as the fire during Caesar's time, each loss was now irreplaceable, since the resources for copying replacement texts no longer existed. Diocletian's rise to power in 284 CE temporarily stabilized the empire but brought new challenges for Alexandria. The emperor's attempt to restore Roman authority included brutal suppression of any perceived disloyalty. When Alexandria revolted in 295 CE, supporting a usurper named Domitius Domitianus, Diocletian personally led the siege that followed. For 8 months, Roman forces blockaded the city, causing starvation and disease that killed thousands. When the walls finally fell, Diocletian's revenge was methodical and severe. He ordered that killing should continue until blood reached his horse's knees. According to legend, only when his horse stumbled and knelt did the slaughter cease. The educated classes, suspected of supporting the usurper with their writing and rhetoric, were specifically targeted. The library district was plundered, with Roman soldiers seeking precious metals from decorative bindings and selling stolen scrolls to fuel their cooking fires. Diocletian's administrative reforms further marginalized Alexandria and its library. He divided Egypt into smaller provinces, reducing Alexandria's importance as a regional capital. More significantly, he established new imperial capitals closer to troubled frontiers, directing resources away from older cultural centers. The foundation of Constantinople by Constantine in 330 CE created a new Christian capital that would gradually eclipse Alexandria as the Eastern Empire's intellectual center. Constantinople's rise represented more than just competition for resources. It embodied a different vision of knowledge and learning. While Alexandria's library had been founded on the ideal of preserving all human wisdom, Constantinople's imperial library focused on texts useful for Christian empire. Works of theology, biblical commentary, and church history received priority over pagan philosophy and ancient science. The new capital attracted Christian scholars who might once have gone to Alexandria, accelerating the transformation of learning from universal to sectarian. The material conditions of scholarship continued to deteriorate throughout the 4th century. The production of papyrus in Egypt declined as agricultural land was converted to grain production for Constantinople's growing population. What papyrus was produced went primarily to government administration rather than scholarly copying. Parchment remained expensive and was increasingly monopolized by Christian scriptoria producing biblical texts. Secular learning was literally running out of materials on which to preserve itself. The codex format that Christians favored was gradually replacing scrolls throughout the library. But converting scroll texts to codices required choices about what to preserve. Works had to be valuable enough to justify the expense of parchment and the labor of copying. These decisions were increasingly made by Christian administrators who prioritized texts compatible with their faith. Works of pagan theology, descriptions of traditional religious practices, and philosophical arguments against Christian doctrine were quietly allowed to deteriorate without being recopied. The social status of traditional scholars was also declining. Where once the title of Mausion member had carried immense prestige, now it marked someone as suspiciously attached to pagan learning. Career advancement in the Roman administration increasingly required Christian baptism, forcing scholars to choose between their intellectual traditions and their economic survival. Many chose survival, undergoing conversions that were more practical than spiritual, creating a generation of crypto-pagan scholars who publicly professed Christianity while privately maintaining older traditions. This religious dissimulation created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion that poisoned scholarly collaboration. Christian scholars suspected their pagan colleagues of secret apostasy, while pagans viewed Christian researchers as intellectual traitors who had abandoned reason for faith. The open debates that had characterized the library's golden age became impossible when participants could not trust each other's sincerity. Knowledge became secretive, shared only among trusted co-religionists rather than openly discussed. The economic model that had sustained the library was also failing. The Ptolemaic system of royal patronage had been replaced by Roman imperial support, but now even that was fragmenting. Wealthy Christians endowed churches and monasteries rather than secular institutions. Pagan patrons, increasingly marginalized, lacked resources for major donations. The library depended on irregular imperial grants that might arrive years late or not at all, forcing administrators to sell valuable texts to pay for basic maintenance. Some scholars attempted to preserve knowledge through private copying, creating personal libraries in their homes. But this privatization of learning accelerated the fragmentation of knowledge. Without the library's central catalogue, scholars could not know what texts others possessed. Forgeries proliferated without the institutional authority to authenticate texts. Errors in copying multiplied without systematic comparison of manuscripts. The careful scholarship that had distinguished Alexandria was dissolving into isolated individual efforts. The relationship between theoretical knowledge and practical application was also changing. Roman engineers had once consulted the library's technical texts for construction projects and military innovations, but the empire's economic crisis meant fewer major projects, reducing demand for sophisticated technical knowledge. Local traditions and rule-of-thumb methods replaced the mathematical precision that Alexandrian scholars had championed. The feedback loop between theory and practice, essential for scientific progress, was breaking down. Medical knowledge suffered particularly from this disconnect. The anatomical discoveries of Herophilus and Eratosthenes required dissection to verify and teach, but Christian doctrine increasingly opposed the practice as disrespectful to the human body. Medical texts describing surgical procedures became meaningless without the opportunity to observe and practice. Ancient pharmaceutical recipes called for ingredients that were no longer traded across the disrupted empire. Medicine regressed from systematic science to traditional healing and religious miracles. The astronomical observations that had been carefully recorded for centuries faced similar challenges. The mathematical models that predicted celestial movements required continuous observation to refine and correct. But the library's observation platforms were neglected, their instruments stolen or destroyed. Without new observations, astronomical texts became historical curiosities rather than living science. The ability to predict eclipses and planetary positions, once a source of Alexandrian pride, was gradually lost. Even basic literacy was declining in the general population. The schools that had prepared students for advanced study in the library reduced their curricula or closed entirely. The complex scripts used for scholarly texts required years of training that fewer families could afford. The pool of potential scholars shrank with each generation, threatening the continuity of learning even if texts could be preserved. Knowledge was becoming the privilege of an ever smaller elite, contradicting the library's founding vision of accessible wisdom. The various communities that had contributed to Alexandria's intellectual diversity were also fragmenting. The Jewish population, which had produced scholars like Philo and contributed to the Septuagint translation, faced increasing restrictions and periodic violence. Many emigrated to Babylon or Constantinople, taking their scholarly traditions with them. The Egyptian priesthood, which had preserved ancient wisdom in hieroglyphic texts, saw their temples closed and their income confiscated. The last priests who could read hieroglyphics died without passing on their knowledge, rendering thousands of texts indecipherable. International scholarly networks that had connected Alexandria with Athens, Rome, and other centers were disrupted by political instability. Travel became dangerous as imperial authority weakened and banditry increased. Letters between scholars were intercepted or lost. The exchange of texts that had enriched all participants ceased as each city focused on preserving its own collections. The cosmopolitan ideal that had defined Alexandrian scholarship gave way to intellectual provincialism. By the early 4th century, the Library of Alexandria retained only shadows of its former glory. The building still stood, though increasingly dilapidated. Scrolls still filled storage rooms, though many were deteriorating beyond recovery. Scholars still worked in the reading rooms, though fewer each year, and with diminishing resources. The institution continued to function, but its vitality was gone. It was like an elderly scholar who could still recite memorized texts but could no longer comprehend new ideas or create original insights. The transformation of the Roman Empire under Constantine added new pressures. Christianity was not merely legalized but became the favored religion, receiving imperial patronage that had once supported traditional institutions. Christian bishops gained political power that they used to suppress pagan learning. The tolerance that had allowed different traditions to coexist in the library was replaced by an aggressive orthodoxy that viewed alternative knowledge as dangerous rather than enriching. Constantine's new capital drew resources and talent from across the empire. Skilled scribes, who might once have worked in Alexandria, were recruited for Constantinople's growing scriptoria. Valuable texts were purchased or confiscated for the new imperial library. The architectural materials from pagan temples were recycled for Christian churches. Alexandria was being systematically stripped of the cultural capital it had accumulated over centuries. The legal framework also shifted against traditional learning. Laws restricting pagan practices initially targeted public sacrifices and temple rituals, but gradually extended to philosophical schools and scholarly institutions associated with paganism. The library, with its statue-filled halls and dedication to the pagan muses, was increasingly vulnerable to legal suppression. Scholars had to carefully frame their work in terms acceptable to Christian authorities, distorting research to fit religious orthodoxy. Yet through all these pressures, some scholars persisted in their mission to preserve knowledge. They worked in increasingly difficult conditions, copying texts by candlelight when oil for lamps became unavailable. They hid valuable scrolls from confiscation, creating secret caches that they hoped future generations might discover. They taught students in private homes when public lectures became dangerous. Their dedication preserved fragments of ancient wisdom through the empire's darkest period, though much was still lost. The economic and social structures that had created and sustained the Library of Alexandria for 7 centuries were collapsing. The Ptolemaic vision of universal knowledge, the Roman adaptation to practical learning, and the cosmopolitan ideal of intellectual exchange were all failing simultaneously. The library had survived fires, wars, and neglect, but it could not survive the fundamental transformation of the civilization that had created it. The stage was set for the final acts of destruction that would eliminate what remained of the ancient world's greatest repository of knowledge. The slow decline of the 3rd and early 4th centuries was perhaps more damaging than any sudden catastrophe could have been. A fire could be extinguished and buildings rebuilt, but the gradual loss of skills, resources, and institutional memory could not be easily reversed. Each scholar who died without training a successor, each text that crumbled without being copied, each tradition that was forgotten, represented an irreversible loss. The Library of Alexandria was dying not in a dramatic conflagration, but through the slow extinction of the culture that had given it meaning. The edict arrived in Alexandria on a spring morning in 325 CE, carried by imperial messengers who had ridden hard from Nicaea. Bishop Alexander of Alexandria read Constantine's words with satisfaction, while pagan philosophers in the Mauseion received the news with growing dread. The Council of Nicaea had established Christian orthodoxy as imperial law, and those who refused to accept its decisions faced not just theological condemnation, but legal persecution. The transformation of the Roman Empire into a Christian state would fundamentally alter the fate of Alexandria's great library and all who worked within its walls. Bishop Alexander had spent years fighting against Arius, an Alexandrian presbyter who argued that Christ was created by God rather than being co-eternal with the Father. This theological dispute might seem abstract, but it had profound implications for how knowledge itself was understood. If Christ was created, then creation could be comprehended through reason and investigation. If Christ was eternally co-equal with God, then fundamental reality transcended human understanding, accessible only through faith and revelation. The victory of Orthodox Christianity at Nicaea meant that faith would increasingly supersede reason as the path to truth. When Alexander died in 328 CE, his successor, Athanasius, inherited both his position and his zealous determination to enforce Nicene orthodoxy. Athanasius was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely convinced that deviation from Orthodox Christianity was not merely error, but evil. He had worked in the library as a young man, studying both Christian texts and pagan philosophy, but he emerged convinced that classical learning was at best irrelevant and at worst actively harmful to salvation. The scholars of the Mauseion watched Athanasius rise to power with increasing alarm. Many of them were Arians or pagans who saw the new bishop as a threat to intellectual freedom. They were correct. Athanasius began a systematic campaign to purge Alexandria of what he considered heretical influences. Arian texts were confiscated and burned. Scholars who refused to accept Nicene Christianity faced exile or worse. The library's collections, accumulated over 6 centuries, were reviewed for compatibility with orthodox doctrine. Yet Athanasius was not simply an anti-intellectual destroyer. He understood the power of texts and established Christian scriptoria that would preserve and copy biblical manuscripts with the same care that pagan scribes had once lavished on Homer. He commissioned new translations and commentaries that would shape Christian understanding for centuries. The techniques of textual criticism developed in the library were redirected toward establishing authoritative versions of Scripture. Knowledge was not being eliminated but transformed and restricted. The conflict between Christian orthodoxy and traditional learning created strange alliances. Arian Christians and pagan philosophers found common cause in opposing Athanasius, despite their fundamental theological differences. They shared a commitment to rational inquiry that Orthodox Christianity seemed to threaten. Secret meetings were held in private homes where Platonic dialogues were read alongside Arian treatises. The free exchange of ideas that had once occurred openly in the library's halls continued in hidden gatherings that risked imperial punishment. Emperor Julian, who ruled from 361 to 363 CE, briefly reversed the Christian transformation. Raised Christian, but converted to paganism through his philosophical studies, Julian attempted to restore traditional learning and religious practices. He reopened temples, restored funding to philosophical schools, and encouraged the library to resume its traditional mission. Pagan scholars emerged from hiding, believing their traditions might survive after all. Julian's restoration revealed how much had been lost in just a few decades. Many priests who had maintained temple libraries were dead or dispersed. Sacred texts had been destroyed or hidden so well they could not be recovered. The chain of oral transmission that complemented written texts had been broken. Young people raised in Christian families had no knowledge of traditional practices that had once been common. Julian could restore buildings and funding, but he could not resurrect the cultural context that had given them meaning. His death in battle against Persia after just 2 years ended any hope of pagan revival. His successors immediately reversed his policies, implementing even harsher restrictions on traditional learning. The brief restoration had actually weakened pagan scholarship by encouraging hidden practitioners to reveal themselves, making them easier targets for subsequent persecution. Many scholars who had emerged during Julian's reign fled Alexandria or converted to Christianity when the inevitable reaction came. The imperial edict of 391 CE represented the final assault on pagan learning in Alexandria. Emperor Theodosius III, encouraged by Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria, ordered the closure of all pagan temples throughout the empire. In Alexandria, this meant the Serapeum, which housed not just a temple, but one of the last functioning parts of the Great Library. For centuries, the Serapeum had served as the public face of Alexandrian scholarship, where citizens could access texts and attend lectures, even as the main Mauseon became increasingly restricted. Theophilus led the Christian mob himself, carrying a cross as they marched toward the Serapeum. The building was magnificent even in decline, its columns of red granite rising above the surrounding city, its halls still containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The pagan philosophers and students who had taken refuge inside knew they were vastly outnumbered. Some fled through back entrances, carrying what texts they could. Others stood their ground, believing that reason and tradition would somehow prevail against religious fury. The destruction was methodical and thorough. Christian crowds, whipped into religious frenzy by sermons about defeating demons and destroying idolatry, broke down the doors and surged inside. The great statue of Serapis, a masterpiece of ancient art that combined Greek and Egyptian traditions, was pulled down and shattered. Its gold and ivory decorations were stripped away, its wooden core burned in the street. The message was clear that the old gods were dead, and their wisdom was worthless. The scrolls suffered various fates depending on who seized them. Some Christian scribes recognized the value of mathematical and medical texts. quietly preserving them for later study. Others made no such distinctions, using ancient papyri to fuel bonfires that celebrated Christianity's triumph. Philosophical works were particularly targeted, seen as the source of arguments that challenged Christian doctrine. Centuries of careful preservation ended in hours of destruction. Theophilus ordered that a church be built on the Serapeum's ruins, using its stones and columns for the new structure. This architectural cannibalism was both practical and symbolic. The physical materials of pagan learning would literally support Christian worship. Carved inscriptions celebrating ancient wisdom were turned face inward, so their words would never again be read. The transformation was complete, not when the old was destroyed, but when it was absorbed and repurposed for the new order. The scholars who survived the Serapeum's destruction scattered across the Mediterranean. Some went to Athens, where the Academy of Plato still functioned, though increasingly harassed by Christian authorities. Others travelled to Persia, where the Sassanid emperors welcomed Greek learning that the Roman Empire now rejected. A few remained in Alexandria, converting to Christianity outwardly, while secretly maintaining their philosophical traditions. The diaspora of Alexandrian scholars spread both knowledge and the bitter memory of its destruction. Among those who remained was Theon of Alexandria, one of the last great mathematicians of antiquity. He had spent decades editing and commenting on classical mathematical texts, creating editions that would preserve ancient geometry and astronomy for future generations. His position as a mathematician rather than philosopher offered some protection, since Christian authorities were less threatened by numbers than ideas. He continued teaching and writing, training his daughter Hypatia in mathematics and philosophy, despite the increasing dangers faced by pagan scholars. Hypatia inherited her father's brilliance and exceeded his courage. By the early 5th century, she had become the most prominent intellectual in Alexandria, teaching mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy to students who came from across the empire. Her lectures drew Christians, Jews, and pagans alike, united in their respect for her learning and character. She corresponded with scholars throughout the Mediterranean, her letters carrying mathematical proofs and philosophical arguments that maintained Alexandria's reputation despite its institutional decline. Her prominence made her a target for those who saw any non-Christian learning as threatening. Cyril, who became Bishop of Alexandria in 412 CE, viewed Hypatia as a dangerous influence. She was a woman teaching men, a pagan influencing Christians, and a philosopher questioning revealed truth. Moreover, she was allied with Orestes, the Roman prefect of Alexandria, who tried to maintain civil order against Cyril's increasingly militant Christian followers. The conflict between Cyril and Orestes represented larger tensions about authority and knowledge in the Christian empire. Orestes believed in Roman law and administrative order, consulting Hypatia on mathematical and philosophical matters relevant to governance. Cyril claimed religious authority superseded civil law, that bishops spoke for God while prefects merely enforced human regulations. Hypatia stood between them, representing a tradition of rational inquiry that both needed but neither fully accepted. The tension exploded in March 415 CE during the Christian season of Lent. A mob of Christian zealots, likely encouraged by Cyril's inflammatory sermons, intercepted Hypatia's carriage as she returned from her daily lectures. They dragged her from the vehicle and into a nearby church, where they stripped her naked and beat her to death with roof tiles. Her body was dismembered and burned, eliminating any possibility of martyrdom through relic veneration. The murder was both savage and calculated, designed to terrorize anyone who might continue her work. Hypatia's death marked a turning point from which Alexandrian scholarship never recovered. If someone of her prominence, connections, and acknowledged virtue could be murdered without consequence, no pagan scholar was safe. The investigations that Orestes demanded produced no convictions. Cyril claimed ignorance of the mob's intentions while suggesting that Hypatia had brought violence upon herself through her dangerous teachings. The message was clear that Christian orthodoxy would tolerate no intellectual rivals. The exodus of scholars accelerated after Hypatia's murder. Her former students carried her mathematical commentaries to Athens, Constantinople, and beyond, preserving her work even as they fled her fate. The houses where philosophical discussions had continued in secret were abandoned. The private libraries that had maintained classical texts were sold, dispersed, or destroyed. Within a generation, the continuous tradition of pagan scholarship in Alexandria that had lasted 8 centuries was effectively ended. Yet the triumph of Christianity did not mean the complete destruction of ancient knowledge. Christian scribes, particularly in monasteries, recognized the value of certain classical texts. Medical works were preserved because healing was considered a Christian duty. Mathematical and astronomical texts were maintained for calculating Easter and understanding God's creation. Even some philosophical works survived, especially those by Plato and Aristotle, that could be interpreted as compatible with Christian theology. The selection process that determined what would be preserved and what would be lost was complex and often arbitrary. A text might survive because a particular monk found it useful, or be destroyed because another considered it dangerous. Works with explicitly pagan religious content were systematically eliminated, but references to gods in literary texts might be interpreted allegorically and preserved. Technical manuals survived better than theoretical treatises. Poetry was preserved more often than philosophy. The physical process of preservation also transformed the texts. Christian scribes copying pagan works often added marginal notes condemning the errors they were transcribing. Passages considered morally offensive were omitted or altered. References to multiple gods were sometimes changed to singular forms that could be interpreted as the Christian God. The texts that survived were not identical to those the Library of Alexandria had preserved, but Christianized versions filtered through centuries of religious interpretation. Some Christian scholars attempted to create syntheses that preserved classical learning within Christian frameworks. John Philoponus, working in Alexandria in the 6th century, wrote extensive commentaries on Aristotle that challenged pagan interpretations while preserving the philosophical arguments. His work demonstrated that Christian scholars could engage with classical philosophy, but only by fundamentally transforming its meaning and purpose. The institutional structure that had supported scholarship was also transformed. Instead of the Mausions community of international scholars pursuing diverse research, Christian Alexandria developed theological schools focused on biblical interpretation. The catechetical school of Alexandria became famous for its allegorical method of reading scripture, applying techniques originally developed for interpreting Homer to understanding the Bible. Knowledge was not eliminated but redirected toward exclusively religious ends. The economic model changed as well. Where the Ptolemies and Romans had funded scholarship through imperial patronage, Christian learning depended on church resources and private donations from the faithful. Copying texts became an act of religious devotion rather than scholarly preservation. Monks laboring in scriptoria saw themselves as serving God rather than preserving human wisdom. This shift in motivation affected what was copied and how carefully the work was done. Languages also shifted during this transformation. Greek remained important for theological discussions, but Coptic, the descendant of ancient Egyptian written in modified Greek script, became increasingly prominent for Egyptian Christians. Latin dominated in the Western Empire. The multilingual environment that had characterized the library, where texts were translated between Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, and other languages, gave way to more rigid linguistic divisions. Each language community preserved its own texts, with less exchange between traditions. The physical ruins of the library buildings were gradually dismantled for building materials. The columns that had supported reading rooms were incorporated into churches. The stones where scholars had walked were used for defensive walls. The lead from roof fixtures was melted down for various uses. The physical erasure of the library paralleled the intellectual transformation, leaving few traces of the institution that had once defined Alexandria. By the middle of the 5th century, the Library of Alexandria existed only in memory and scattered texts. The building complexes of the Mouseion and Serapeum were ruins or repurposed structures. The community of scholars had dispersed or converted. The collections had been burned, stolen, scattered, or absorbed into Christian institutions. The ideal of universal knowledge had been replaced by the certainty of revealed truth. The transformation was complete. Yet the story was not simply one of Christian destruction of pagan learning. It was a complex process of selection, transformation, and preservation that determined which aspects of ancient knowledge would survive into the medieval and modern worlds. Christian scribes preserved texts that would otherwise have been lost, even as they destroyed others. The techniques of scholarship developed in Alexandria continued in new institutional contexts. The ideal of collecting and preserving knowledge persisted, even if directed toward different ends. The Christian transformation of Alexandria demonstrated that knowledge is never neutral, but always embedded in social, political, and religious contexts. The library had claimed to preserve all human wisdom, but it had always made choices about what to collect and how to interpret it. The Christian authorities, who destroyed much of its collection, were also making choices, terrible and irreversible choices that impoverished human understanding, but choices that seemed logical and necessary within their worldview. The loss was catastrophic but not complete. Enough survived, scattered across the former empire and beyond, to eventually inspire new attempts to gather and preserve human knowledge. The Renaissance would recover some of what was lost, though much remained irretrievably destroyed. The idea of the Library of Alexandria would prove more durable than its physical existence, inspiring future generations to create new repositories of knowledge while remembering the fragility of all such enterprises. The Byzantine garrison commander stood on Alexandria's walls in December 641 CE, watching the Arab army approach across the desert. For over a year, the forces of Amr ibn al-As had besieged the city, the last major Byzantine stronghold in Egypt. Inside the walls, a population that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands had dwindled through war, plague, and emigration. The great institutions that had defined Alexandria for nearly 1,000 years existed only as shadows and ruins. Yet legends would later claim that the Arab conquest delivered the final blow to the Library of Alexandria. Amr ibn al-As was an experienced commander who had already conquered Syria and Palestine for the expanding Islamic Caliphate. He understood that Alexandria represented more than just a strategic port. It was a symbol of Greek and Roman dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean, a center of Christian theological authority, and according to stories that had reached the Arabs, once home to the greatest collection of books the world had ever known. What he found when he entered the city would disappoint those expecting magnificent libraries waiting to be plundered. The city that surrendered to Amr after a 14-month siege bore little resemblance to the Alexandria of the Ptolemies or even the early Roman period. Earthquakes had toppled many of the grand buildings. The harbor that had once welcomed ships from across the Mediterranean was partially silted, its great lighthouse damaged and functioning only sporadically. The palace quarter where the Mouseion had stood was largely abandoned ruins, picked over by generations of stone robbers who had carried away anything valuable for construction elsewhere. The Arab historians who recorded the conquest made no contemporary mention of finding or destroying any great library. Ibn Abd al-Hakam, writing the earliest surviving Arabic account of the conquest about 2 centuries later, describes the city's churches, its architectural wonders, and its commercial importance, but says nothing about books or scholars. The silence is significant. Arab culture highly valued learning and books. If a functioning library comparable to legend had existed, it would surely have been noted and probably preserved. Yet centuries later, a story emerged that would become one of the most controversial in library history. The tale first appears in the writings of Ibn al-Kifti in the early 13th century, nearly 600 years after the event supposedly occurred. According to this narrative, Amr discovered a vast library and wrote to Caliph Omar, asking what should be done with the books. Omar allegedly replied with words that would echo through history. If these books contain matters that agree with the Quran, they are superfluous. If they contain matters that contradict the Quran, they are heretical. In either case, they should be destroyed. The story continues that the books were distributed to Alexandria's public baths, where they were used as fuel for 6 months. The image of ancient wisdom feeding bathhouse furnaces has haunted historians and inflamed religious tensions for centuries, but the evidence suggests this story is almost certainly a medieval fabrication created for political or religious purposes long after any actual events. The problems with the burning story are numerous and compelling. First, the timeline makes no sense. By 641 CE, the Library of Alexandria as a functioning institution had been gone for at least 2 centuries. The Serapeum had been destroyed in 391 CE, and no credible source mentions any significant library surviving the subsequent upheavals. What books remained in Alexandria were scattered in private collections, churches, and perhaps small monastic libraries, not gathered in any single great repository. Second, the technological details are implausible. Bathhouses in 7th century Alexandria burned wood, not books. Papyrus and parchment, the materials of ancient books, burned too quickly and produced too much smoke to be practical fuel. The claim that books could heat baths for 6 months suggests an impossibly large collection, far exceeding what any reasonable estimate would place in Alexandria at that time. The story seems designed more for dramatic effect than historical accuracy. Third, the alleged response of Caliph Omar contradicts both his known character and Islamic practice. Omar was noted for his pragmatism and his respect for the people of the book, Christians and Jews, whose scriptures were recognized in Islamic tradition. The early Muslim conquerors generally preserved useful knowledge from conquered territories, especially in subjects like medicine, astronomy, and administration. The binary logic attributed to Omar sounds more like a medieval philosophical exercise than an actual policy decision. The myth's creation and propagation reveal more about medieval interfaith polemics than historical events. It first emerged during the Crusades when Christian and Muslim writers were crafting narratives that demonized their opponents. Later writers embellished the story, adding details that made it more dramatic but less credible. By the Renaissance, it had become accepted truth in Europe, used to demonstrate Islamic hostility to learning despite extensive evidence of Muslim scholarship and preservation of ancient texts. The reality of early Islamic engagement with Alexandrian learning was far more complex and constructive. The Arab conquerors found a city that still contained scattered scholars and texts, though nothing approaching the legendary library. These remnants were not destroyed but studied and absorbed. Christian and Jewish scholars who could translate Greek texts into Arabic were highly valued. The new Muslim rulers needed administrative knowledge to govern their expanding empire, medical knowledge to treat diseases, and astronomical knowledge for navigation and religious observance. John the Grammarian, also known as John Philoponus, exemplified the continuity of Alexandrian scholarship into the Islamic period. Though he died just before or during the Arab conquest, his works were quickly translated into Arabic and became influential in Islamic philosophy. His critiques of Aristotelian physics and his arguments for the creation of the world resonated with Muslim theologians. The transmission was not direct from the ancient library, but through the Christian scholarly tradition that had preserved and transformed selected ancient texts. The translation movement that began shortly after the conquest would eventually dwarf any destruction that might have occurred. Within a century, the Abbasid caliphs were sponsoring systematic translations of Greek works into Arabic. Texts that had been scattered and neglected in the former Byzantine Empire were gathered, studied, and preserved in Arabic versions. The irony is striking that Islamic scholars would become the primary preservers of Greek learning that Christian authorities had often suppressed or ignored. The establishment of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad around 830 CE under Caliph al-Ma'mun represented a conscious attempt to recreate something like the Library of Alexandria. Al-Ma'mun sent delegations to Byzantine territories to acquire Greek manuscripts, offering generous payments or negotiating treaties that included books as tribute. The House of Wisdom employed Christian and Jewish translators alongside Muslim scholars, creating an interfaith intellectual community reminiscent of Alexandria's cosmopolitan Golden Age. The translation process was sophisticated and systematic. Texts were not simply rendered word for word into Arabic, but carefully interpreted and annotated. Technical terms were coined or borrowed, creating an Arabic scientific vocabulary that would influence languages from Persian to Spanish. Multiple translations of important works were compared to establish accurate texts, employing the textual criticism methods that Alexandrian scholars had pioneered. Commentary was added to explain obscure passages and relate Greek ideas to Islamic thought. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Nestorian Christian working in 9th century Baghdad, exemplified this scholarly tradition. He translated over 100 works from Greek and Syriac into Arabic, including crucial medical texts by Galen that would otherwise have been lost. His methodology was rigorous, comparing multiple manuscripts and noting variations. He wrote about the challenges of translation, discussing how to convey not just words but concepts across cultural boundaries. His work preserved Alexandrian medical knowledge that European scholars would later retranslate from Arabic into Latin. The subjects that Muslim scholars found most valuable reveal their practical and theoretical interests. Mathematical works were prized, with Euclid's geometry and Ptolemy's astronomy receiving multiple translations and extensive commentary. Medical texts were urgently needed for the hospitals that Islamic cities were establishing. Philosophical works, especially those of Aristotle and Plato, were studied for their logical methods and metaphysical insights. Even texts on agriculture, engineering, and military tactics found eager readers. But the preservation was selective, shaped by Islamic values and interests. Works of pagan theology were generally ignored, seen as superseded by monotheistic revelation. Literary works that celebrated wine or sexual freedom were often bowdlerized or suppressed. Historical texts that contradicted Islamic understanding of prophecy might be challenged or reinterpreted. The Muslim scholars were not neutral preservers but active interpreters who transformed what they preserved. The original Greek texts often disappeared once Arabic translations were complete, creating a peculiar situation where Islamic versions became the primary sources for ancient knowledge. This was not necessarily destructive, since Arabic translations were often more widely copied and distributed than Greek originals had been. A medical text that might have existed in a single deteriorating Greek manuscript could be reproduced in dozens of Arabic copies spread from Spain to India. The expansion of the Islamic Empire created a vast market for books that exceeded anything the ancient world had known. Paper, introduced from China in the 8th century, made book production far cheaper than papyrus or parchment had been. Islamic cities developed book markets where scholars, students, and general readers could purchase texts. Private libraries proliferated, with wealthy Muslims competing to build prestigious collections. The bibliomania that had once characterized Ptolemaic Alexandria reappeared in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba. Cairo, under the Fatimid Caliphate from 9 to 69 CE, developed particularly strong connections to Alexandria's intellectual legacy. The Fatimids claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima, and saw themselves as inheritors of both Islamic and pre-Islamic wisdom. They established the House of Knowledge, consciously modeled on both Baghdad's institution and Legends of Ancient Alexandria. Their library reportedly contained over 1 million volumes, though this number likely includes duplicate copies and multi-volume works. The Fatimid collection in Cairo included texts that had survived from Alexandria through various paths. Some had been preserved in Coptic monasteries, hidden during periods of persecution. Others had travelled to Constantinople and returned via diplomatic gifts or military conquest. Still others had been preserved in private collections, passing through generations of scholars who valued learning above religious differences. The paths of preservation were complex and often untraceable, but they maintained thin threads of continuity with ancient scholarship. Medieval legends about the Library of Alexandria proliferated during this period, each culture claiming credit for preserving its wisdom or blame for its destruction. Byzantine chroniclers blamed the Arabs, Arabs blamed the Christians, and Christians blamed the pagans, or Julius Caesar. These competing narratives served contemporary political purposes, justifying current conflicts through historical precedents. The library became a symbol whose meaning changed depending on who was telling the story. The Crusades brought Latin Christian scholars into contact with Arabic texts that preserved Greek learning they thought had been lost forever. The shock of discovering that Muslim infidels had preserved and expanded upon ancient wisdom challenged European assumptions about cultural superiority. The translation movement from Arabic to Latin that followed would spark the Renaissance, but it also created new myths about Islamic destruction of learning to resolve the cognitive dissonance of being intellectually indebted to religious enemies. One of the most poignant medieval legends claimed that books from Alexandria had been hidden in sealed caves or buried in the desert, waiting to be rediscovered. Treasure hunters and scholars searched for these mythical caches, occasionally finding Coptic or Greek manuscripts that fed hopes of greater discoveries. The legend reflected a deep cultural trauma about lost knowledge and a hope that what was destroyed might somehow be recovered. Even today, such stories resurface periodically, though no credible evidence of hidden Alexandrian libraries has ever emerged. The role of Alexandria itself during the Islamic period was dramatically diminished. The city that had once been the second largest in the Mediterranean became a provincial town, important mainly for its harbour. The Arab conquerors established Fustat, later Cairo, as Egypt's capital, shifting the centre of power inland. Alexandria's population continued to decline, and its ruins were increasingly quarried for building materials. The physical remnants of the Mausion and Serapeum disappeared stone by stone. Yet Alexandrian scholars continued to work in reduced circumstances. Christian theologians maintained the allegorical interpretation methods developed in the catechetical school. Jewish scholars preserved Talmudic traditions that incorporated Alexandrian philosophy. A few Muslim mathematicians and astronomers worked in the city, though most ambitious scholars went to Cairo, Damascus, or Baghdad. The city maintained a reputation for learning that exceeded its actual intellectual production. The interaction between different religious communities in Islamic Alexandria created unique opportunities for knowledge exchange. Christian physicians taught Muslim students. Jewish merchants carried books between Alexandria and other Mediterranean ports. Muslim judges consulted Christian and Jewish scholars on matters of precedent and interpretation. These informal networks preserved and transmitted knowledge outside official institutions, maintaining intellectual continuity through personal relationships rather than institutional structures. The Arabic papyri discovered in modern excavations reveal the quotidian reality of Islamic Alexandria. Administrative documents, personal letters, and commercial contracts show a functioning, if diminished, city. Educational texts indicate that basic literacy and numeracy were taught, though advanced scholarship was rare. Religious texts from all three monotheistic traditions appear, sometimes in the same archaeological contexts, suggesting continued, if cautious, intellectual exchange. The transformation of Greek knowledge through Arabic translation was not mere preservation, but creative reinterpretation. Muslim scholars added their own discoveries to ancient texts, correcting errors and extending theories. Al-Hazen's work on optics surpassed anything in the ancient sources. Al-Khwarizmi's algebra created new mathematical fields unknown to the Greeks. Ibn Sina's medical synthesis improved upon Galen and Hippocrates. The Islamic world was not simply a passive conduit for ancient knowledge, but an active participant in its development. This creative engagement with ancient texts makes it impossible to fully separate preservation from transformation. The astronomy that medieval Europe inherited through Arabic sources was not the same as what Ptolemy had written in Alexandria, but a synthesis incorporating Persian observations, Indian mathematics, and Arab innovations. The medicine that Crusaders brought back from the East combined Greek theory, Arab practice, and empirical discoveries unknown to antiquity. The library's legacy lived on, but transformed beyond what its founders could have imagined. The legend of Caliph Omar burning the library served different purposes for different audiences. For medieval Christians, it demonstrated Islamic barbarism. For Muslims, it could represent the superiority of revealed truth over human philosophy. For modern scholars, it illustrates how historical myths develop and persist despite contradictory evidence. The story's endurance says more about human psychology and cultural conflict than about actual historical events. By the time the Crusaders conquered Alexandria briefly in 1365, they found no trace of the legendary library. They looted the city and massacred much of its population, but there were no great collections of books to burn or steal. The Venice-based raiders were interested in commercial goods and strategic advantage, not ancient wisdom. Their chroniclers barely mentioned the city's scholarly heritage, focusing instead on its reduced fortifications and depleted wealth. The Mamluk period that followed saw Alexandria further marginalized. The military slave dynasties that ruled Egypt from Cairo had little interest in the coastal city except as a prison for political exiles and a minor port for specialized trade. The few scholars who worked there did so in isolation, without institutional support or significant libraries. The city that had epitomized cosmopolitan learning became provincial and insular. The Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517 brought new administrative structures, but no revival of Alexandrian scholarship. The Ottomans, like previous Muslim rulers, valued the preservation and study of ancient texts, but they concentrated their intellectual resources in Istanbul, Damascus, and Cairo. Alexandria remained a backwater, its ancient ruins continuing to disappear into new construction or the rising Mediterranean. The story of the Arab conquest and its aftermath reveals the complex fate of Alexandrian learning. The library as an institution had vanished long before the Arabs arrived, but its legacy persisted in scattered texts and scholarly traditions. The Islamic world became the primary preserver and developer of Greek scientific and philosophical knowledge, even as legends blamed Muslims for destroying the library. The translation movements that carried Alexandrian wisdom from Greek to Arabic to Latin and beyond ensured that some portion of ancient knowledge survived, though transformed through each cultural transmission. The myth of the Arab destruction of the library serves as a cautionary tale about historical memory and cultural conflict. It reminds us that the past is constantly being reimagined to serve present purposes, that legends can overshadow facts, and that the destruction of knowledge is often a gradual process of neglect and transformation rather than a single, catastrophic event. The Library of Alexandria was indeed destroyed, but by centuries of political instability, religious conflict, and economic decline, not by any single conqueror or catastrophe. The fragment was barely 3 lines long, preserved only because a medieval scholar had quoted it to illustrate a point about Greek meter. Yet those 3 lines of Sappho's poetry blazed with such intensity that they made the loss of her complete works almost unbearable to contemplate. Of the 9 books of her poetry that the librarians of Alexandria had carefully collected and catalogued, Only one complete poem, and these scattered fragments survived. The rest, perhaps 10,000 lines of the most celebrated lyric poetry in the ancient world, had vanished with the library that once preserved them. Sappho was called the 10th muse by the ancients, her poetry considered equal to divine inspiration. The Alexandrian scholars had compiled her complete works into 9 books organized by meter, adding commentary and biographical information. They preserved not just her famous love poetry, but also epithalamia, wedding songs, hymns to gods, and personal reflections on aging and death. Plato called her wise, Aristotle ranked her with Homer, and even centuries later, Roman poets spoke of her with awe. What survived was largely accidental. One complete poem, the Ode to Aphrodite, was preserved because a literary critic quoted it in full to demonstrate perfect poetic structure. Other fragments existed because grammarians cited them to illustrate unusual words or meters. Egyptian papyri, used for mummy wrappings or garbage dumps, occasionally yielded a few lines when excavated. In 2004, a new fragment was discovered showing Sappho contemplating old age, its broken lines suggesting profound meditations now lost forever. The scholarly apparatus around Sappho's work was equally valuable and equally lost. The Alexandrian commentaries had explained historical references, identified the real people behind poetic pseudonyms, and preserved alternative readings of disputed passages. They had collected biographical information from sources now vanished, creating a context for understanding the poetry. All of this interpretive tradition, developed over centuries of scholarship, disappeared along with the primary texts. The loss of Aristotle's second book of the Poetics represents a different kind of catastrophe. The first book, which survived through Arabic translation, fundamentally shaped Western literary criticism with its analysis of tragedy. But ancient sources repeatedly reference a second book that analyzed comedy with equal thoroughness. Aristotle supposedly discussed what made things funny, how comedy could provide moral instruction, and the social function of laughter. This systematic treatment of humor by one of history's greatest philosophers existed in the Library of Alexandria, but nowhere else thereafter. The implications of this loss extend beyond literary theory. Comedy was central to Athenian democracy, with satirical plays offering political criticism that would be dangerous in other formats. Aristotle's analysis would have provided insights into Greek political culture, social relationships, and the boundaries of acceptable discourse. His lost work might have explained references in surviving comedies that modern scholars find obscure. It might have preserved examples from plays now completely lost, expanding our understanding of ancient theatre. Umberto Eco made this lost book central to his novel The Name of the Rose, imagining it as so dangerous to medieval Christianity that monks would kill to keep it hidden. While this was fiction, it captured something true about the loss. Aristotle's systematic approach to comedy might have legitimized humor as a subject for serious study centuries earlier. The absence of authoritative ancient thought on comedy contributed to its lower status compared to tragedy in subsequent literary traditions. The historical works of Manetho and Berossus represented attempts to translate entire civilizations' memories into Greek, making them accessible to the wider Mediterranean world. Manetho, an Egyptian priest working in the early Ptolemaic period, wrote a comprehensive history of Egypt from mythical origins through the Persian conquest. His work, commissioned for the Library of Alexandria, listed every pharaoh with their reign lengths and major achievements. It provided a chronological framework that modern Egyptologists still use, though the complete text is lost. What survived of Manetho came through quotations by later historians who had access to complete copies. Josephus quoted him extensively when discussing Jewish history in Egypt. Christian chronographers used his king lists to synchronize biblical and Egyptian history, but these fragments, perhaps 5% of the original, leave enormous gaps. Entire dynasties are represented by just names and reign lengths. The narrative sections that would have explained political changes, cultural developments, and historical causation are almost entirely gone. Berossus performed a similar service for Babylonian history, writing in Greek for the Seleucid court, but depositing copies in Alexandria's library. His Babylonica covered mythology, astronomy, and history from creation through Alexander's conquest. He had access to cuneiform texts going back thousands of years, temple archives that contained astronomical observations, king lists, and religious literature. His work was the only systematic attempt to make this vast Mesopotamian heritage available to the Greek-speaking world. The fragments of Berossus that survive hint at profound losses. He described a Babylonian flood narrative with striking parallels to the biblical story, but different details that might have illuminated the relationship between Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions. He provided lists of astronomical observations going back centuries, data that would be invaluable for understanding ancient science. He explained Babylonian mathematical methods that influenced Greek astronomy. But without the complete text, these tantalizing glimpses remain isolated and incomplete. The scientific and technical literature lost with the library represents practical knowledge that had to be painfully rediscovered. Hero of Alexandria wrote detailed instructions for constructing automated theaters, hydraulic organs, and steam-powered devices. While some of his work survived, references in other texts indicate that much more was lost. He described surveying instruments that could measure distances without direct access, military machines that surpassed anything used in medieval warfare, and architectural techniques for constructing vaults and domes. The medical losses were particularly tragic in human terms. Herophilus had written detailed accounts of human dissection, describing anatomical structures that would not be rediscovered until the Renaissance. His work on the nervous system identified motor and sensory nerves, located specific brain functions, and traced neural pathways. Eratosthenes had developed surgical procedures for treating wounds, removing tumors, and repairing damaged organs. Their works existed in multiple copies in the Library of Alexandria, but survived only in fragmentary quotations by later medical writers. These medical texts contained not just theoretical knowledge, but practical instructions that could have saved lives. Descriptions of surgical instruments, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic techniques were lost. Ancient procedures for cataract surgery, described in surviving fragments, suggest sophisticated techniques that were not redeveloped until modern times. The library contained case studies documenting treatments for various diseases, creating a clinical database that took centuries to rebuild. The astronomical observations accumulated over centuries represented irreplaceable data about cosmic events. Babylonian astronomers had recorded eclipses, planetary positions, and unusual celestial phenomena for over 1,000 years. These observations, collected and systematized in the library, would have provided crucial data for understanding long-term astronomical cycles. Hipparchus used such records to discover the precession of equinoxes, but the primary data was lost, making it impossible to verify or extend his calculations. Chinese astronomical records that might have reached Alexandria through trade routes could have documented supernovae, comets, and other phenomena not visible from the Mediterranean. The library's scholars had certainly collected observations from India, which had sophisticated astronomical traditions. The loss of these multicultural astronomical archives meant that later astronomers had to work with fragmentary data, slowing the development of accurate planetary models. Literary losses extended far beyond Sappho. Of the approximately 80 plays that Aeschylus wrote, only 7 survive complete. Sophocles wrote over 120 plays. We have 7. Euripides was more fortunate, with 18 surviving from about 90. The Alexandrian library had complete collections of all 3 tragedians, plus hundreds of comedies, satyr plays, and works by lesser-known dramatists. The random survival of so few plays means our understanding of Greek theatre is based on less than 5% of what existed. The lost plays included alternative treatments of myths that would have shown different perspectives on familiar stories. The surviving fragments mention plays about Amazons, African adventures, and Eastern tales that would have demonstrated the geographic and cultural range of Greek imagination. Lost comedies address political events now known only through historical accounts, providing contemporary perspectives that would enrich our understanding of ancient democracy. Historical works beyond Manetho and Berossus represented entire genres now lost. Universal histories attempted to synthesize all human history into coherent narratives. Local histories preserved traditions of smaller cities and regions. Biographical collections documented the lives of philosophers, poets, and politicians. Travel narratives described journeys to India, sub-Saharan Africa, and northern Europe. These works existed in Alexandria but survived only when quoted by later authors for specific purposes. Ctesias wrote extensively about Persia and India based on his years as a physician at the Persian court. His work was criticized by some ancient authors as unreliable, but it contained eyewitness accounts of Persian administration, court ceremonies, and cultural practices. His descriptions of India, though mixed with legendary elements, preserved genuine information about trade routes, natural resources, and political structures. The complete work would have provided alternative perspectives on cultures usually seen only through Greek and Roman eyes. Philosophical works lost with the library included not just major treatises but entire schools of thought. The Stoics had written extensively on logic, physics, and ethics, but most of their foundational texts are gone. We know Stoic doctrine primarily through later summaries and Roman adaptations. The Epicureans suffered similar losses, with Epicurus's 300 scrolls reduced to 3 letters and some fragments. Alternative philosophical schools that might have offered different approaches to fundamental questions disappeared entirely. Mathematical works by Apollonius on conic sections survived only partially, with entire books referenced but lost. His method of exhaustion, a precursor to calculus, was described in works that no longer exist. Diophantus wrote 13 books on algebra. Only 6 survived through Byzantine copies. The lost books might have contained solutions to problems that took centuries to rediscover. They might have developed mathematical techniques that would have accelerated the scientific revolution. Geographical knowledge accumulated from centuries of exploration was particularly vulnerable to loss. Detailed accounts of trade routes, including distances, landmarks, and seasonal variations, existed in commercial documents stored in the library. Maps, always rare and valuable, were especially unlikely to survive. The Alexandrian scholars had created systematic geographic texts that combined astronomical observations with travel reports, producing accurate descriptions of the known world. Most of this geographical synthesis was lost. Musical theory and notation represented another category of irreplaceable loss. The Greeks had developed sophisticated systems for recording melodies and rhythms, but the notation was complex and required specialized knowledge to interpret. The library contained treatises on musical theory, collections of composed pieces, and descriptions of instruments and performance practices. Without these texts, ancient music became silent, its reconstruction based on scattered fragments and theoretical descriptions. Religious texts from various traditions were lost as different groups gained and lost power. Egyptian religious literature in hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts became unreadable after the last priests died. Gnostic texts presenting alternative Christian theologies were deliberately destroyed. Mystery religion texts were suppressed as their practices were banned. Each tradition that disappeared took with it unique perspectives on humanity's relationship with the divine. Technical manuals for crafts and trades contained accumulated practical knowledge, instructions for producing specific dyes, working particular metals, or creating architectural elements were trade secrets committed to writing in the library. Agricultural manuals described techniques for improving yields, managing irrigation, and controlling pests. These practical texts were less likely to be copied than literary or philosophical works, making their loss particularly complete. The catalogue of the library itself, Callimachus's Pinnaces in 120 scrolls, would have been invaluable for understanding what existed. It contained not just titles and authors, but biographical information, critical assessments, and the opening lines of works. It represented the first systematic attempt to organize all human knowledge. Its loss means we cannot even know with certainty everything that was lost, only what happened to be mentioned in surviving sources. Personal documents in the library provided irreplaceable historical evidence. Letters between scholars documented intellectual development and debate. Administrative records revealed how the library functioned. Acquisition lists showed what texts were considered valuable. Student notes indicated how texts were taught and understood. These everyday documents, unlikely to be copied, provided context that would have made surviving texts far more comprehensible. Scientific instruments and models that accompanied texts were equally important losses. Astronomical devices demonstrated planetary motion. Mathematical models illustrated geometric proofs. Anatomical preparations showed biological structures. Maps and charts provided geographic information difficult to convey in words. The loss of these three-dimensional teaching aids meant that textual descriptions became harder to understand and implement. The interconnected nature of the collection magnified individual losses. A philosophical text might reference a historical work that cited a geographical treatise that quoted a literary piece. When parts of this web of knowledge disappeared, the surviving portions became less comprehensible. References to lost works became meaningless. Arguments based on missing evidence became impossible to evaluate. The context that gave meaning to individual texts was often lost, even when the texts themselves survived. Languages and scripts died with the library. The ability to read Egyptian hieroglyphics preserved for millennia ended when the last priests who understood them died. Cuneiform tablets that might have been translated were left unread. Regional scripts and dialects documented in the library were forgotten. Each lost language represented not just words, but entire ways of understanding and describing the world. The tragedy was not just the loss of information, but the loss of methodologies. The Alexandrian scholars had developed techniques for textual criticism, authentication, and preservation that had to be reinvented. They had created systems for organizing and retrieving information that were forgotten. They had established standards for scholarly communication that disappeared. The infrastructure of learning was lost along with its content. What survived did so through extraordinary circumstances, and often in degraded form. Texts were preserved because they were useful for teaching grammar, not because their content was valued. Works survived in Arabic translation when Greek originals were lost. Christian monks preserved pagan texts they found useful while destroying those they considered dangerous. The selection was random, pragmatic, or ideological rather than systematic. The discovery of papyri in Egyptian garbage dumps has revealed how much was lost. Fragments of otherwise unknown works appear regularly, suggesting that what survived represents a tiny fraction of what existed. Each discovery, a few lines of a poem, part of a historical chronicle, a section of a mathematical proof, hints at vast losses we can barely quantify. The library had collected human knowledge from across the known world, and most of it vanished forever. The physician in Constantinople watched helplessly as another patient died from an infection that seemed treatable but resisted every remedy he knew. It was 542 CE, and the plague of Justinian was killing thousands daily across the Byzantine Empire. In his desperation, he recalled hearing about ancient texts that described successful treatments for similar diseases, surgical procedures that could drain infected tissues, and pharmaceutical preparations that fought corruption in wounds. But those texts had been in the Library of Alexandria, and now they existed only as rumors and fragments, leaving him to fight the plague with incomplete knowledge that might have been comprehensive centuries earlier. The mathematical proof seemed so close that the Islamic mathematician could almost grasp it. Working in 9th century Baghdad, he was trying to solve cubic equations using methods that built on ancient Greek geometry. References in surviving texts mentioned that Apollonius of Perga had written 8 books on conics, but only 4 had survived through the Byzantine copying tradition. The lost books supposedly contained methods for solving problems that now consumed years of effort. He was essentially rediscovering mathematics that had already been discovered, wasting intellectual energy that could have advanced human knowledge rather than merely recovering it. Consider what those 4 lost books of Apollonius might have contained. The surviving books developed the theory of ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas with such sophistication that they were not fully understood until the 17th century. The lost books reportedly went further, developing methods that approached what we now call analytic geometry. Had they survived, Descartes might have been building on established foundations rather than inventing them. The scientific revolution might have begun centuries earlier, with all the technological and social changes that would have entailed. The mechanical engineer in medieval Paris studied the fragments of Hero's writings that described automatic doors and steam-powered devices. The descriptions were tantalizing but incomplete, missing crucial measurements and construction details that the full texts would have provided. He spent months trying to reconstruct mechanisms that Hero had documented completely, achieving partial success through trial and error. The steam engine principle that Hero had demonstrated in the 1st century CE would not be practically applied until the 18th century, a delay of 1700 years that might have been avoided if the complete technical manuals had survived. The history of medicine provides perhaps the most tragic example of unnecessary suffering caused by lost knowledge. Herophilus and Erasistratus had mapped the human nervous system through systematic dissection, identifying the difference between sensory and motor nerves, locating the seat of intelligence in the brain rather than the heart, and describing the circulation of blood through vessels. This knowledge, documented in texts held by the Library of Alexandria, was lost when religious and cultural taboos ended human dissection and the texts themselves were destroyed or neglected. For over 1,000 years, European and Islamic physicians worked with fundamental misconceptions about human anatomy. They believed Galen's errors about blood movement, not knowing that Erasistratus had been closer to the truth. They treated brain injuries based on philosophical speculation rather than anatomical knowledge. They performed surgeries without understanding neural pathways, causing unnecessary paralysis and pain. Each patient who died or suffered from this ignorance represented a human cost of the library's destruction that compounds over centuries into millions of preventable deaths and immeasurable suffering. The surgical procedures described in Alexandrian medical texts included operations for cataracts, removal of bladder stones, and treatment of wounds that would not be redeveloped until the Renaissance or later. Ancient surgeons had developed specialized instruments and techniques through centuries of practice and documentation. When this accumulated knowledge was lost, surgeons had to rediscover through dangerous trial and error what had once been established procedure. Every patient who died during this relearning process was a casualty of lost knowledge. Pharmaceutical knowledge suffered similar setbacks. The library had contained systematic descriptions of medicinal plants from across the known world, their preparation, dosage, and interactions. Dioscorides' work survived partially, but references within it point to more comprehensive texts that were lost. Ancient physicians had documented which combinations of drugs were effective and which were dangerous, knowledge gained through centuries of observation. Without these texts, medieval physicians poisoned patients with incorrect doses or failed to treat conditions for which effective remedies had once been known. The astronomical observations lost with the library set back our understanding of the cosmos by centuries. Hipparchus had discovered the precession of equinoxes using Babylonian observations spanning hundreds of years. But the primary data was lost, making it impossible for later astronomers to refine his calculations or extend his methods to other celestial phenomena. Chinese astronomical records that might have reached Alexandria could have documented supernovae visible from Earth, providing data about stellar evolution that was not recovered until modern times. The delay in astronomical understanding had practical consequences beyond scientific theory. Accurate calendars were essential for agriculture, and the lost observations could have improved planting and harvesting schedules. Navigation depended on astronomical knowledge, and better star charts could have prevented shipwrecks and enabled earlier oceanic exploration. The economic impact of these delays, failed harvests, lost ships, delayed trade routes, accumulated over centuries into enormous losses of life and wealth. Literary losses impoverished human culture in ways that cannot be quantified but are deeply felt. The complete works of Sappho would have provided not just aesthetic pleasure but insights into ancient society, gender relations, and emotional expression. The lost comedies of Aristophanes and others would have preserved political commentary that could illuminate historical events known only through official accounts. Every lost poem, play, and narrative represented a unique perspective on human experience that can never be recovered. The psychological impact of cultural loss extends beyond the specific content of destroyed works. Societies that lose their historical memory become vulnerable to repeating past mistakes. Without access to complete historical records, people cannot learn from their ancestors' experiences. The library had contained detailed accounts of political systems that succeeded and failed, economic policies that created prosperity or disaster, and social arrangements that promoted stability or revolution. The loss of these case studies meant that each generation had to learn through experience what could have been learned through study. Consider the political implications of lost historical works. Aristotle had studied 158 different constitutions to write his analysis of political systems, but most of these studies were lost with the library. His conclusions about democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny were preserved, but the evidence on which he based them disappeared. Later, political theorists had to work with incomplete data, unable to test Aristotle's generalizations against his sources or explore alternative interpretations. The development of political science as an empirical discipline was delayed by centuries. Economic knowledge suffered similar losses. The library had contained commercial documents describing trade routes, price fluctuations, and market mechanisms across the ancient world. This economic data could have accelerated the development of economic theory, providing empirical evidence for concepts that remained purely theoretical until modern times. The understanding of inflation, trade balances, and market dynamics that took centuries to develop might have emerged much earlier, with access to the library's commercial archives. Technological innovation was particularly hampered by the loss of technical manuals and engineering documents. The Romans had developed concrete that could set underwater, a technology lost until modern times. The library might have contained the exact formula and production methods. Ancient techniques for producing flexible glass, mentioned in several sources, disappeared completely. Damascus steel, whose production method was lost, might have been documented in the metallurgical texts the library collected from across the known world. The social consequences of technological delay extended far beyond convenience. The horse collar, which multiplied agricultural productivity, was not adopted in Europe until the 10th century, though it might have been described in the library's agricultural texts from China or Central Asia. The delay in this simple innovation meant centuries of lower crop yields, more human labor required for farming, and reduced population capacity. Millions lived in poverty who might have prospered with earlier access to basic technological improvements. The loss of geographical knowledge delayed exploration and cultural exchange. The library had contained accounts of voyages to sub-Saharan Africa, India, and possibly even the Americas. These narratives included practical information about currents, winds, and navigation landmarks that had to be rediscovered through dangerous trial and error. Each ship lost to unknown hazards. Each expedition that failed for lack of geographical knowledge represented lives that might have been saved and connections that might have been made earlier. Alternative calendrical and mathematical systems from different cultures were particularly significant losses. The library had collected knowledge from Babylonian, Egyptian, Indian, and possibly Chinese sources. These different approaches to understanding number and time could have accelerated mathematical development through comparison and synthesis. The concept of zero, crucial for advanced mathematics, was known in India and might have reached Europe centuries earlier through Alexandrian texts. The religious and philosophical texts lost with the library might have prevented centuries of conflict. Alternative Christian theologies that emphasized tolerance and philosophical inquiry were destroyed as heretical. Gnostic texts that offered different interpretations of divinity and humanity's purpose were systematically eliminated. Pagan philosophical works that might have provided common ground between different religious traditions were lost. The monopoly of orthodox interpretation that followed contributed to religious wars and persecution that might have been avoided with access to alternative viewpoints. The scientific method itself was delayed by the loss of methodological texts. The Alexandrian scholars had developed sophisticated approaches to empirical observation, hypothesis testing, and theoretical modeling. They understood the importance of controlling variables, reproducing experiments, and peer review. These methodological insights, documented in texts that were lost, had to be painfully redeveloped during the scientific revolution. Centuries of pseudoscience and superstition might have been avoided with earlier access to rigorous methodological frameworks. The environmental knowledge lost with the library had consequences we are only now beginning to understand. Ancient texts described climate patterns, documented species that are now extinct, and recorded ecological relationships that took centuries to rediscover. Agricultural texts contained information about crop rotation, soil management, and pest control developed over millennia. The loss of this accumulated ecological wisdom contributed to agricultural failures, famines, and environmental degradation that might have been prevented. Educational methods and curricula developed in Alexandria were lost along with the texts they used. The systematic approach to teaching mathematics, from basic arithmetic through advanced geometry, had to be reinvented. The progression of philosophical education, from logic through ethics to metaphysics, was disrupted. The integration of practical and theoretical knowledge that characterized Alexandrian education was replaced by the medieval separation between scholastic and technical learning. If the Library of Alexandria had survived intact, the trajectory of human civilization would have been fundamentally different. The Dark Ages, characterized by the loss of classical knowledge in Western Europe, might never have occurred or might have been much briefer. The Islamic Golden Age might have built on complete Greek texts rather than fragments, achieving even greater advances. The Renaissance might have begun centuries earlier with complete classical texts available, rather than requiring reconstruction from fragments. Consider a world where steam power was developed in the 3rd century rather than the 18th, where antibiotics were discovered in the 8th century rather than the 20th, where democracy developed gradually from ancient models rather than through violent revolution, where different cultures maintained continuous dialogue through preserved texts rather than viewing each other through ignorance and prejudice. The library's survival might have meant humanity reaching its current level of development centuries or even a millennium earlier. The space age might have begun in what we call the medieval period. Computers might have been developed during the Renaissance. Medical advances that we celebrate as modern achievements might have been routine for centuries. The human suffering avoided, the achievements accelerated, the connections made earlier, all of this represents the true cost of the library's destruction. Every delay in human progress, every wheel reinvented, every lesson learned through suffering rather than study, compounds over time into a tragedy whose scale we can barely comprehend. The scholars who witnessed the library's decline and destruction understood something of what was being lost. Their desperate attempts to save what they could, hiding texts in caves or monasteries, smuggling scrolls out of Alexandria, or memorizing what could not be preserved physically, showed their recognition of the catastrophe. But even they could not have imagined the full consequences, the millions who would die from treatable diseases, the wars that might have been prevented, the human potential unrealized. Yet perhaps the greatest tragedy was not the specific knowledge lost, but the vision the library represented. The idea that all human knowledge could be collected, preserved, and made accessible to those who sought it. The belief that different cultures could contribute to a universal understanding. The commitment to preserving the past while advancing toward the future. This vision, more than any specific text or discovery, was what humanity lost when the Library of Alexandria disappeared, and it is this vision that we still struggle to recreate, knowing now through bitter experience how fragile and precious such institutions are. The impact of the library's destruction continues to ripple through history. Every scientist who spends years rediscovering what was already known, every scholar who works with fragments wishing for complete texts, every student who struggles to understand references to lost works, experiences the ongoing consequences of that ancient catastrophe. The Library of Alexandria burns still in every gap in our knowledge, every broken chain of transmission, every wisdom that must be painfully relearned rather than gratefully inherited. The server room hummed with the white noise of cooling fans as the system administrator watched another bank of hard drives fail at the Internet Archive in San Francisco. It was a routine hardware failure in 2024, the kind that happened monthly when you were trying to preserve over 99 petabytes of human knowledge, but each failure carried echoes of Alexandria. The magnetic particles that stored billions of pages were degrading, just as papyrus had crumbled, the bits flipping from 1 to 0 with the same finality as fire-consuming scrolls. The only difference was speed. What had taken centuries in Alexandria could happen in nanoseconds in the digital age. Brewster Kahle, founder of the Internet Archive, had explicitly modeled his institution on the Library of Alexandria, even using the Lighthouse of Pharos as its logo. His stated goal was to provide universal access to all knowledge, the same dream that had motivated Ptolemy I over 2 millennia earlier. But where the Ptolemies had dealt with thousands of scrolls arriving on ships, the Internet Archive faced billions of web pages changing every second. Where Alexandrian scribes had worried about insects and humidity, modern digital librarians battled bit rot, format obsolescence, and the constant physical degradation of storage media. The parallels were uncomfortably precise. Just as papyrus lasted perhaps a century before requiring recopying, hard drives failed after 3 to 5 years. Just as the shift from scroll to codex had stranded texts in obsolete formats, the progression from floppy disks to CDs to cloud storage left information trapped in unreadable media. Files created in WordPerfect or Lotus 123 were as inaccessible to modern systems as hieroglyphic texts had become after the last Egyptian priests died. The technology changed, but the fundamental problem remained that every medium for preserving knowledge was temporary. Digital preservation created new vulnerabilities that the ancient librarians could never have imagined. A single electromagnetic pulse could erase centuries of accumulated data in an instant. A solar flare of sufficient magnitude could destroy electronic storage worldwide, achieving in minutes what had taken centuries in Alexandria. Ransomware attacks could lock away knowledge as effectively as any fire, demanding payment for access to humanity's own cultural heritage. The centralization of data in cloud services meant that corporate bankruptcy or policy changes could eliminate millions of documents overnight. The promise of perfect digital copies proved illusory in practice. Each file format required specific software to read it, and that software required specific operating systems, which required specific hardware architectures. This chain of dependencies meant that preserving a document required preserving an entire technological ecosystem. It was as if saving a scroll required also saving the ability to read Greek, understand ancient handwriting, and manufacture the oil for lamps to read by. The Library of Congress estimated that it was losing access to older digital materials faster than it could migrate them to new formats. Copyright law created barriers to preservation that would have baffled ancient librarians. The Internet Archive faced constant lawsuits for preserving books and websites, with publishers arguing that even preservation copying violated their exclusive rights. Academic journals charged thousands of dollars for access to research, often funded by public money. Scientific data that could advance human knowledge was locked behind paywalls that most of the world's population could not afford. The tragedy was not that knowledge was being destroyed, but that it was being hoarded, made inaccessible to all but the wealthy. Political pressures on modern libraries eerily echoed those that had plagued Alexandria. In 2022, librarians across the United States reported unprecedented numbers of book challenges and removal demands, with over 2,500 different titles targeted. School libraries were being defunded or closed entirely in some districts. The books being challenged were not random but followed patterns similar to ancient suppressions. Texts that challenged authority, presented alternative viewpoints, or discussed marginalized communities. The mechanisms were bureaucratic rather than violent, but the effect was the same erasure of undesired knowledge. The situation was worse in authoritarian regimes where digital surveillance made controlling information easier than ever before. The Great Firewall of China blocked access to vast swaths of human knowledge for over 1 billion people. Internet shutdowns in Kashmir, Myanmar, and Iran cut populations off from global information networks. Social media platforms removed content based on opaque algorithms and political pressure, causing documentation of protests, human rights abuses, and alternative narratives to vanish as thoroughly as any ancient text. The digital age had provided new tools for both preserving and destroying knowledge. Climate change posed threats to cultural heritage that dwarfed any previous natural disasters. Rising seas threatened coastal libraries and archives from Venice to Miami. The British Library's basement storage had flooded, damaging irreplaceable manuscripts. Extreme heat warped magnetic tape and degraded optical media faster than expected. Wildfires in California had come within miles of the Internet Archive's physical location. Hurricane Sandy had destroyed millions of documents in New York archives that had survived since colonial times. Each disaster was a small Alexandria, unremarked and unmourned outside specialist communities. The indirect effects were equally devastating. Political instability caused by climate migration led to the abandonment of libraries and universities. Economic stress reduced funding for preservation just when it was most needed. The Syrian civil war had destroyed libraries in Aleppo that contained manuscripts surviving from the medieval period. The National Museum of Brazil had burned in 2018, taking with it recordings of indigenous languages that existed nowhere else. Each conflict and catastrophe created gaps in the human record that could never be filled. Yet technology also offered unprecedented opportunities for recovering lost knowledge. Multispectral imaging could read palimpsests where medieval monks had scraped away ancient texts to reuse the parchment. The Archimedes palimpsest, discovered in 1906, had revealed previously unknown works by the great mathematician, recovered through techniques that made erased ink visible again. Similar projects were discovering lost classical texts hidden beneath medieval prayers, each recovery a small victory against the entropy of time. The Oxyrhynchus papyri, discovered in an ancient Egyptian garbage dump, continued to yield treasures as new techniques were developed to read damaged fragments. Machine learning algorithms could now match tiny pieces of papyrus, like solving a jigsaw puzzle with millions of pieces. Texts that had been considered unreadable when first excavated were revealing their secrets to patient digital analysis. Fragments of Sophocles, Euripides, and other ancient authors emerged from what had seemed like worthless scraps, each piece expanding our understanding of the ancient world. Artificial intelligence offered both promise and peril for knowledge preservation. Large language models trained on digitized texts could potentially reconstruct missing portions of damaged documents by understanding patterns in language and thought. But they could also generate convincing forgeries, creating false knowledge that might be accepted as genuine. The same technology that could help preserve human culture could also pollute it with fabrications indistinguishable from authentic texts. The democratization of knowledge through digital means surpassed anything the Ptolemies could have imagined. A student in rural Bangladesh could access texts that would have required a journey to Alexandria in ancient times. Wikipedia, despite its flaws, represented the largest encyclopedia ever created. Written in hundreds of languages by millions of contributors, Project Gutenberg had digitized over 60,000 books, making them freely available worldwide. The dream of universal access to knowledge seemed closer to realization than ever before. But this democratization was fragile and incomplete. Digital divides meant that billions still lacked meaningful internet access. Language barriers excluded most of humanity from resources predominantly in English. Technical knowledge required to navigate digital resources created new forms of illiteracy. The abundance of information paradoxically made finding reliable knowledge harder, as truth drowned in an ocean of misinformation, propaganda, and noise. The speed of change in the digital era compressed centuries of transformation into decades. Social media platforms that had seemed permanent disappeared, taking with them millions of posts, images, and connections. GeoCities, once hosting millions of personal websites, vanished when Yahoo shut it down, erasing a significant portion of early internet culture. Google regularly discontinued services, giving users minimal time to export their data. Each corporate decision eliminated records that future historians would need to understand our era. The concept of permanence itself was being redefined. The Alexandrian librarians had thought in terms of preserving knowledge for eternity, but modern digital librarians planned for migrations every few years. The average lifespan of a website was less than 3 years. Government databases were regularly purged or restructured, breaking links and losing information. Scientific data from experiments that could never be repeated was stored on media that would be unreadable in a decade. We were creating more information than ever before, while simultaneously losing it at unprecedented rates. Cultural memory was fracturing in ways that would have horrified Alexandrian scholars. Without shared texts and common references, societies struggled to maintain coherent identities. The echo chambers of social media created parallel realities where different groups literally could not access the same information. The manipulation of search results and recommendation algorithms meant that what knowledge people could access was increasingly determined by opaque corporate decisions and targeted advertising. The universality that Alexandria had aspired to was being replaced by personalized information bubbles. Traditional libraries struggled to adapt to digital challenges while maintaining their physical collections. Budget constraints forced impossible choices between preserving crumbling books and licensing expensive digital resources. Librarians, the modern successors to Alexandrian scholars, fought to maintain professional standards of accuracy and accessibility while being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information. Many left the profession taking with them irreplaceable knowledge about organization, preservation, and the subtle art of connecting people with the information they needed. The lessons of Alexandria had never been more relevant or more ignored. The concentration of digital infrastructure in a few massive companies recreated the vulnerability of a single library. Amazon Web Services hosted vast portions of the internet. Its failure would be a digital Alexandria. Google's algorithms determined what information billions of people could find. Facebook's policies shaped global discourse. These new Alexandrias were private, profit-driven, and accountable to shareholders rather than scholars. Yet individuals and institutions continued the Alexandrian mission against enormous odds. The Longnau Foundation created the Rosetta Project, etching thousands of languages onto nickel discs that could last millennia. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault preserved biological knowledge against catastrophe. Independent archives documented marginalized communities whose histories were excluded from official records. Librarians worldwide fought censorship, preserved endangered materials, and taught information literacy to new generations. The reconstruction of fragmentary ancient texts through modern technology offered hope that loss might not be permanent. The Herculaneum papyri, carbonized by Vesuvius's eruption, were being read through advanced imaging that could distinguish ink from charred papyrus. Each scroll recovered added to our understanding of ancient philosophy and literature. Similar techniques might someday recover texts from other archaeological sites, gradually rebuilding portions of what was lost from Alexandria and other ancient libraries. International collaborations created resilience that no single institution could achieve. Locks, lots of copies. Keep stuff safe, distributed preservation across multiple institutions worldwide. The Digital Public Library of America aggregated resources from thousands of institutions. The European Union's Europeana project digitized cultural heritage from across the continent. These networks meant that destruction of any single node would not eliminate knowledge entirely, though coordination remained challenging and funding perpetually inadequate. The story of the Library of Alexandria had become a cautionary tale, retold in each generation, its meaning shifting with contemporary concerns. For Renaissance humanists, it represented the danger of religious extremism. For Enlightenment philosophers, it symbolized the triumph of superstition over reason. For modern librarians, it embodied the fragility of cultural memory. Each retelling revealed current anxieties about knowledge preservation while potentially obscuring the complex historical reality of the library's gradual decline. What remained constant was the human impulse to gather, preserve, and share knowledge despite all obstacles. The same drive that had motivated Ptolemy VIII to establish his universal library inspired Tim Berners-Lee to create the World Wide Web, with the principle that information should be free. The scholars who had risked their lives to save texts from Alexandria's ruins had spiritual successors in the librarians of Sarajevo who formed human chains to save books from bombardment, the Iraqi archivists who hid manuscripts from ISIS, and the Ukrainian digital librarians who backed up their nation's cultural heritage as bombs fell. The true lesson of Alexandria was not simply that knowledge was fragile, but that its preservation required constant vigilance, resources, and courage. Every generation had to choose anew whether to value learning over ignorance, openness over secrecy, preservation over forgetting. The technologies changed, but the fundamental challenge remained to transmit the accumulated wisdom of humanity to future generations while adding new discoveries and insights. The Library of Alexandria had failed in its mission of permanent preservation, but it had succeeded in something perhaps more important. It had established an ideal that transcended its physical destruction. The vision of universal knowledge accessible to all who sought it had inspired countless libraries, universities, and archives. The methods its scholars had developed for organizing, analyzing, and transmitting knowledge had become the foundation of all subsequent scholarship. The very fact that we mourned its loss demonstrated that its values had survived even when its collections had not. Standing at our current moment, we we face challenges both similar to and different from those that destroyed Alexandria. Digital technology offers unprecedented opportunities for preserving and sharing knowledge, but also new vulnerabilities. Political polarization threatens the consensus necessary to support cultural institutions. Economic inequality restricts access to information that should be universal. Climate change poses existential risks to physical and digital infrastructure alike. The next great destruction of knowledge might come not from fire or neglect, but from electromagnetic pulses, solar flares, or the simple decision of a technology company to shut down a service. Yet we also possess advantages the Alexandrians lacked. We understand the mechanisms of preservation at molecular and quantum levels. We can copy information infinitely without degradation. We can distribute knowledge so widely that no single catastrophe could eliminate it entirely. We have the cautionary example of Alexandria itself, teaching us what happens when knowledge is concentrated, neglected, or suppressed. Most importantly, we have a global community that values learning and fights to preserve it, even when governments and corporations do not. The Library of Alexandria burns eternally in human memory, a wound that reminds us of our capacity for both creation and destruction. Every library built, every archive established, every database backed up represents an attempt to heal that wound, to assert that knowledge matters, that the past has value, that the future deserves to inherit what we have learned. We cannot recover what was lost in Alexandria, but we can ensure that future generations do not look back at our era with the same sense of irretrievable loss. The choice we face is not whether to preserve knowledge, that battle is already being fought on thousands of fronts by millions of people. The choice is whether to support them adequately, whether to value libraries as much as weapons, archives as much as profits, truth as much as power. The Library of Alexandria died not in a single conflagration, but through centuries of neglect, underfunding, and political violence. If we allow modern repositories of knowledge to suffer the same fate, we will deserve the condemnation of future generations who will wonder how we could have repeated such an obvious mistake. The dream of Alexandria lives on in every search query answered, every book digitized, every manuscript preserved, every student taught to read critically and think freely. It lives in the Internet Archive's scanning centers, in Wikipedia's volunteer editors, in librarians fighting censorship, in scientists sharing data openly. It lives wherever human beings choose to value knowledge over ignorance, preservation over destruction, sharing over hoarding. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but the vision it embodied remains humanity's best hope for transcending the limitations of individual mortality and collective forgetting. We are all librarians of Alexandria now, custodians of human knowledge in an age when information is both more abundant and more fragile than ever before. The question is not whether we will face our own Alexandrian catastrophe, but how we will respond when we do. Will we have created enough redundancy, enough distributed copies, enough institutional resilience to survive? Will we have transmitted not just information, but the wisdom to use it wisely? Will future generations thank us for our foresight or curse us for our negligence? The Library of Alexandria burned, but libraries endure. Knowledge was lost, but learning continued. Texts vanished, but ideas survived. The human spirit that created that first great library creates new ones still, each an act of faith that the future is worth preparing for, that knowledge is worth preserving, that wisdom can transcend the entropy that dooms all physical things. In the end, the Library of Alexandria's greatest legacy is not what it preserved, but what it inspired, the eternal human struggle against forgetting, the unquenchable desire to know and remember and share. That struggle continues, and as long as it does, the Library of Alexandria lives on.